So anyway, what I wanted to do today is kind of just go back to the Italian school for a little while and then move on to the French post-World War II, particularly Sartre and Henri Lefebvre. The Henri Lefebvre, by the way, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I think this is a really great starting point in terms of, trying to understand the tasks facing, real education in the future in the philosophical sense, right? Lefebvre was the Communist Party philosopher, really, in France for many, many years, and he was kicked out in the late 50s. He had many debates with Altos Era, too. He was really against structural Marxism in the name of more everyday Marxism, and very, very important, as Chris knows, to Guy Debord and Gerard Lebovici and others, and Raoul Vanagan. The whole Situationist crowd was very much close to Lefebvre. In fact, Debord was a student.
And outed at the same time.
Yes, that's right.
He was inside and outside.
That's correct, yeah. So a major thinker, someone very under thought about here in the United States. I think he's a much better writer than most of the people we've engaged. He's very direct in what he's trying to do. I know that a year and a half ago we did Dialectical Logic. Stanley did, or attempted to do it, and he did a handbook on dialectical logic, one of his first contributions. Wrote a book on Nietzsche and philosophy. So very important, and also a contemporary of Sartre's, and in my opinion, the two most open-ended, one being a party member and then outside the party being kicked out, and Sartre, of course, is the fellow traveler par excellence, always the fellow traveler, to the PCF, but never a member of the party, and this was the post-World War II, and Sartre, started a movement called Radical Democracy. This was his thing, and of course the journal Temps Moderne. So I want to go there, and then I thought, it's up to you guys. I think it'd probably be best maybe next week, but we can wait 2 weeks, and then do Altos Era Negre together. We could do Altos Era's theoretical anti-humanism. We can talk about dates on that as well. So we would do the Altos Era historical task of Marxist philosophy, which would fold nicely with this, give you a kind of sense of where Marxist philosophy would want to go. Is there such thing as Marxist philosophy? What would be, the epistemological, is there a metaphysics still here in Marxism? Is there, really a new knowledge? Is the distinction between science and ideology really necessary at a point, as a point? So these are things that we, probably can engage through that. And then I thought multitude of Negre from the 90s, Time for Revolution, would be a good ending point. I don't know if you guys saw the Facebook page where we put up Negre, Balibar, and I forgot her last name, Ludwida, the historian, younger historian, speaking about the Yellow Vest movements, it's on the Situations website.
Well, it's in French.
It's in French, unfortunately, yeah.
But all the other ones are in English.
Yeah.
They're pretty good. I watched them all.
Okay, good, yeah, so it's up on the, what does it mean? And also the right, I should do this, and I have a very good friend in Montreal that I've been in discussion with. This is one of the major figures now in France on the new right, has been there for a long time. But he's intelligent, it's not like you're just getting, someone out of the blue. This is someone that Telos, actually Paul Piccone, brought to the consciousness of the American left back in the 80s and 90s. The Benoist is a kind of right-wing Nietzschean. It comes out of that tradition of Nietzsche that goes back to Julius Evola, Ernst Jünger, to a degree. So they're influenced in this way. So anyway, if you're interested. So anyway, they have a commentary on the Yellow Vests as well, and think it's a historic moment. But the historic movement is not really for the left. The historic movement is for maybe possibly Marine Le Pen, And what's the other the granddaughter? that's now out there. She came here and she's a friend of Bannon's,
Yeah,
and this
yeah.
is a real thing. No, but she's
No,
she's in her
she's far
20s.
to the-
She's the Ocasio-Cortez of the
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
Oh
I'm
my
sorry to
God.
be this way, but it gives us kind of the movie. I mean, I'm
Interesting.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I think the New York
I'm not
Review
really
books,
sorry.
Did a very sexy image of her, with her streaming blonde hair and, the new face of the far right in France.
Right.
God.
Yeah.
But but they read.
Yeah.
This is the thing. They quote Montaigne, they quote Rousseau, they quote, and they don't have the worst politics in the world. They're about work too. They're against the dignity of work. They want, better pay.
Dignity of leisure.
Right, exactly. They're about the dignity of leisure, right, exactly.
I have a neighbor who's a French speaking and visits often, she and her
Right.
husband. And she's kind of conservative, but she likes the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests.
Yeah.
But she detests the casseurs, who are basically, I think, just the anarchists. They're the ones
Right.
that are dressed in black and
Right.
burn cars and stores and stuff
Right,
like that.
right.
So it's,
Our friend John Clark.
there's
He's
a
always
real-
dressed in black.
There's a real split. There seems to be a split between the two groups. I don't
Right,
know.
yeah, I'm sure of that, yeah.
I see.
Well, I mean, it raises the interesting question of populism, really, in a way, because that populism can go right or left, and populism or popular uprisings are never really just left. And in fact, the right has been much more adept at mobilizing these units, these moments, and using it to their advantage in many ways. I mean, when Trump talks about the base, he's talking about a new kind of right-wing populism that pervades his government. No matter about his approval ratings, right, he consistently is going to have 25 to 30%. It's that other 20%, 21% that you worry about. But, they'll follow him to, like James Jones and, Jamestown, like Jim Jones, right? Right. That's So that's a problem, and the right-wing populism that comes out of a real split, between, especially Nietzsche, you have a left-wing Nietzscheanism that played out and a right-wing Nietzscheanism, and a lot of this new right is framed, especially people like de Menoir, is framed by this Nietzschean right-wing, which is all over Nietzsche in a certain way, all over, so it's not like, this very simple appropriation for the left of Nietzsche, in some ways, so this is a very complicated set of situations, right, that are facing us going forward. And then the question is, look, again, we live in New York City, right? We're sophisticates, but you go around the country, you can imagine. I mean, I can go to a cafe in New Orleans, which is a sophisticated, kind of southern town, but you wouldn't believe the right-wing, stuff going on, down in these places, and, where the Kennedy assassination was planned. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, anyway. Let me go back to this. So today, again, I want to go back to a couple of moments here. I think the main thing to take from the Italian school, Della Volpe and Colletti, is that they also are both outsiders, right, to the Gramscian base of the PCF. I mean, the PCI, for the Italian Communist Party. Even though Della Volpe was the chief architect, right, of the philosophy for the party, he served in Italy like Altos Era served to the PCF. So Della Volpe and Altos Era are very well, are connected in that sense. You could put that Della Volpe and are two people that are still connected to, the party politics, right, as philosophers, right, and significant as philosophers, right, in a sense. And Della Volpe had a very active school, again, of whom the major member and contributor was Lucio Colletti. And we looked at Marxism and Hegel, and I don't know if it's active in your mind, but, the Marxism and Hegel is an attempt, the first chapter that we're going to read, is to rid the tradition, to rid the tradition of faulty thinking because of the influence of Lenin, Plekhanov, etc., that a whole generation was completely wrong about the dialectic of matter. This is where he's going here. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
That's where Della Volpe is going?
No, where Colletti goes.
Colletti goes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Della Volpe is more Kantian, he's a little more careful, but again, there's this anti-Hegelian moment because they want to ground Marx epistemologically, right? What are the backgrounds for Marx's, knowledge, right? As a knowledge base. What are the conditions for the possibility of Marxism as a producer of knowledge?
Yeah, well,
Right.
Korsch wasn't a big fan of Lenin's philosophy either.
He split,
Huh?
too. He split because of that, and Lenin split from him, too. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, going back to Korsch is obviously, precursors to this.
Right.
Again, in Western Marxism, we're touching, the kind of top end, that begins with Lukács' philosophy. Yeah, remember, they're all academics except for Gramsci. They're all academics. All of these people were teachers. They were all professors. They were not, people on the streets or people that were actively engaged in, organizational structures on the ground, etc. Gramsci, as you know, started out as a militant, was a party member, he was a politician, he was a member of parliament, and then he spent the last 11 years of his life, in prison and very sickly. Yeah, of which we have the documents. But other than that, Georgy Lukács ended up in Budapest teaching, right? He was in the Stalinist night, if you want to call it that, the long night. He was, basically a writer and a teacher and an archivist in the Soviet Union before he went back to Hungary, right? Certainly Korsch ended up teaching in the United States at Tulane University, first and foremost, and then at other places in the 30s and the 40s, and lived to be, I think, till 1961, Korsch lived, right? So another philosopher as a professor, right? Altos Era was the professor. He lived on the campus almost. It's like he would live next to the Sorbonne. That's what's out. His whole life was the office and the home, right? With occasional trips to Moscow and a few other, in Italy. He loved Italy. Yeah,
He
loved
spoke
it.
Italian.
Yeah, he spoke Italian.
That's
yeah,
pretty
yeah,
good, actually.
Yeah, he loved Franco. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so you also and then of course Lefebvre was a professor many years, right? Too. Sartre, different. So maybe Sartre and Gramsci could be put in different categories. Sartre started out as a lycée teacher. He wrote Nausea. That was enough to get him become a privileged stipendiary of Gallimard, the great publishing house, and he didn't have to be teaching no more, right? Yeah, he told him to take the, job, and he argued against the pantheon his whole life and against the academics. And the great combination between, as part of background, is really the conversation that we're getting in Search for a Method and also in the critique is between Sartre and Paul Nizam, his best friend growing up. Paul Nizam, the author of The Watchdogs, which was a book, Philosophers and the Established Order. Great working class guy. Father was a railroad conductor. Wrote a great novel called Aden Arabi, right? And The Watchdogs, and he wrote also a history of materialist philosophy in the ancient world, Epicurus and the atomist tradition. Nizam. Very interesting, completely forgotten today, not talked about, nobody writes about him, etc. But really a real player. And Jean-Paul Sartre like this. Sartre had three friends in his life, in my view. That Nizam, who died in the Spanish Civil War. Camus, they broke in 1952, didn't talk to each other, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, right? Who was an academic, but a very smart academic. Those were his three good friends. He broke with Giacometti. Giacometti got struck by a car. He said, "I didn't think I was alive until this moment." Sartre said, "I'll see you later." That was the end of the friendship. You weren't alive until yeah. Well, what's wrong with you? I don't know what really went on. Who knows? But that was the story about Sartre and Giacometti. Yeah, yeah. Always this antagonist. But he, in a way, since we're going to deal with him today, this is the father of France, post-World War II, the formation of the journal, Les Temps Modernes, right, with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, and of course, André Gorz came on, Jean Palan, and this was a major event. This was a journal of ideas and praxis, the first of its kind, really, in a way, in terms of political praxis post-World War II. Yeah, very major. Before that, you had surrealist journals like the Minotaur, based on Picasso. You had many things. You had the other journals were Critique, where George Bataille, and then Esprit, where Ricoeur and others in the Catholic tradition. In fact, Altos Era published his first work in Esprit. Right? These were the three major journals in French academic life, or to the intelligentsia. They took it back, yeah. So this was 1945, still going today. Still going today. 74 years operative, yeah, 3 generations. And he started this when he was 40 years old, post-World War II. Being in Nothingness was published 1943, which was his major philosophical treatise in that part. So anyway, now, in relation to the Italian Communist Party, I'm trying to do this relationally, and we can talk more a little bit about Della Volpe and Colletti. But Sartre in 1961 gives a Rome address on subjectivity. 1961. He gives a Rome address, and he's invited by students of Della Volpe. So these connections are all kind of happening there. As most of you know, this is the emergence of Antonioni as a major filmmaker. It is also the period of, post-neorealism after the great upsurge from the Rossellini, but you begin to see, the effects of neorealism on Italian cinema. So you have the cinema developing here, in the Italian sector out of neorealism, which to me, I agree with Dominique Zanda. The French are very intelligent, but the Italians are gods in terms of in films. She was asked this when she did the Bertolucci, Il Conformista. So anyway, so this was going, and of course, as you know, the new wave, Godard and company, started with the Cahiers du Cinema, 1959. So this was a very crucial period. 14 years after the formation, if you will, of Automne Moderne. Very, very important to remember this as we go forward. So Sartre gives a Rome address. Lacan, by the way, Rome has always been the place, right? Lacan gave the discourse on Rome 1953 after he's kicked out of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He's delegitimated by the official psychoanalytic movement. So the Rome discourses are interesting. 53, and of course, as most of you know, Freud's The Slips, right, of the Botticelli, right, happens in his visit to Rome. So Rome has a very interesting significance from psychoanalysis all the way up to what is the role of subjectivity in Marxism. If that's another kind of large thematic trace here. So anyway. So this was a relationship, again, that I think brought Sartre closer and closer. He started with the Marxism early on, reading Marx, but it wasn't until Nizam's death and after the war that Sartre began the radical conversion, if you will. Yeah, and I think, again, dialogues he had earlier with Nizam. You can kind of sense this, because Nizam was an outright militant. Outright. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Go ahead, no, yeah, please.
Was the Automne Moderne politically oriented from the beginning? 'Cause I don't think Merleau-Ponty is at all politically oriented.
Well,
I think
he
Sartre
was.
at the time,
He
right?
was.
Okay.
He was. He wrote a book. Speaking of politics, Merleau-Ponty wrote a book called Adventures of the Dialectic. And that's a book worth reading because it critiques what he considers to be Sartre's ultra-Bolshevism. So the hyper-dialectic, he calls it. It's really worth reading because Merleau-Ponty is one of the smartest characters
Yeah.
on the block. I mean, really first rate. I don't know if you know this name, and we really should do a seminar. I mean, just so much time in the day, right? Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908 to 1961, died early. His wife was a child psychoanalyst, a part of the Lacanian school. In fact, Lacan's, and we'll talk about this if you join me in the Freud for Philosophy, four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis is very heavily indebted to Merleau-Ponty's working notes called The Visible and the Invisible, in which he does, speaking of politics, dialectical thinking, he has a section on dialectics and interrogation. And, speaking also of politics, I mean, I'm glad you raised this question. Also, Humanism and Terror was an attempt to justify somewhat the Stalinist moment against Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. So this is a very, very, very strange people, because these people were very well aware of the gulags, right? Very well aware, but they didn't publish anything. They thought it would be used poorly by, if the bourgeois gets a hold of this, it was the end of, quote unquote, the idea of communism or the idea of Marxism. So they were very careful in what because they knew, they very well knew. So it's good to keep in mind. So Adventures of the Dialectic, right? And Humanism and Terror. And
What was the
many
section, visible and the invisible? There's a certain section. you said.
dialectic and interrogation. It's a beautiful attempt to look at what dialectics is. This is a first-rate mind. This is one of the great phenomenological minds. I mean, if you ever have the chance, you should read, as an artist, you should read Cézanne's Doubt, which is a magnificent contribution to art history. The Phenomenology of Perception is the book that sort of opened him up, but his dissertation, The Structure of Behavior, is very interesting as an attack on behaviorism, against Skinnerian and Watsonian behaviorism as a psychology. And he was very well aware of Freud, but he, again, became part of, and this is the thing that's interesting, existential psychoanalysis. But for Merleau-Ponty, you may be able to say it was a phenomenological psychoanalysis, right, in a sense. It's always looking at the primacy of perception. Yeah. So it's very interesting, So the preconscious is really what, in Freudian vocabulary, the PCS is what Merleau-Ponty is always studying. Image projection and perception. Yeah, a beautiful book, The Phenomenology of Perception, and his work on nature, very, very much. And, by the way, Merleau-Ponty was the teacher of Nikos Poulantzas, the great Greek, political theorist. So it's not, I mean, I'm sorry to, because you raised the question and we weren't so political, but he was very political because a lot of people flocked to his class for this kind of stuff. And actually, Poulantzas wrote on Sartre and legal philosophy, which was very interesting too. So there are a lot of cross-fertilizations going on here. Yeah. And if you want to read the eulogy of Sartre to Merleau-Ponty, it gives you an idea of how good Sartre was in terms of addressing the human subject, so to speak. Yeah, in a lot of ways. Okay, so yeah, there's Maurice Merleau, and then of course, I mean, look, I know I'm going all over the place here, but again, this is important. Jean Genet, when he wrote The Blacks as a play, said Merleau-Ponty didn't know much about perception because he didn't really understand what The Blacks was about. So you get this kind of, this kind of dynamic that's going on during this period as well, in the late 50s, early 60s, and of course, as some of you know, and I know David read part of it, the Saint-Genet, the sections on Genet and his choice by Sartre, where Sartre applies his method of psychoanalysis to Jean Genet. You don't remember we did a...
Yeah,
okay, all right, well, anyway, it's okay.
Many things.
Yeah. But yeah, very interesting. Sartre wrote actually five authors he used as examples for existential psychoanalysis. Genet was the first one, 1952, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and then the great study of the Flaubert, yeah, and then he did some in-between stuff, but those were the four major authors, yeah, yeah. Jeunet couldn't pick up his pen after he read Sartre's analysis of him. It's kind of like when Thomas Mann brought Joseph and his brothers to Freud to read, as a reader.
I'm reading
You know?
Joseph and his brothers.
Oh, you
I've
are,
never heard
good,
this story.
okay, yeah, yeah. And Freud sent back Thomas Mann a commentary, and Thomas Mann says, "I didn't know I said that." It's a great story, yeah. So anyway, all right, so today I think it's important to look at what Sartre's moment was in all of this, and to me, he was the one who brought in the question of freedom, spontaneity, back to Marxism, right? In a way, he was really against this kind of orthodox, right, reductionistic, economically deterministic type of Marxism. And if you read Existentialism as a Humanism, which was a text he wrote in 1946, the journal's created 45, 46, he's commissioned by Adam Schaff, a Polish philosopher, and he writes in 1946, Existentialism is a Humanism, in which he justifies existentialism against reductionistic Marxism. What I mean by reductionistic Marxism, that one is fixed by class, one is fixed by economically deterministic arguments, etc. One cannot think, really, other than that, So it becomes sort of like an orthodoxy, almost a machine-like mechanical Marxism, we call it today, or automatic Marxism. And this is another thing, going back to this whole thing about coming up with tax stuff, or the 1% versus the 99%. To me, these are metaphors of a kind of automatic Marxism. That's the best you're gonna get out of that. You don't really have a dialectical tension really working that leads towards understanding, at least to my mind, I hope people, pick up some seeds and, some reactions there, but I don't really think it's gonna, really lead to real political praxis ultimately. Okay? So I don't know if you had a chance to read Marxism and maybe that's a good point, and I can go back a little bit, because Sartre is very Hegelian in his approach, Hegelian Marxism. So he's in some ways, not the Colletti. He's not looking to ground Marxism epistemologically like Colletti and others are. He's interested in Marxism as a horizon philosophically from which we cannot think beyond yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is his thing. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Just one quick question back
Just gonna
before.
time issue, yeah.
What was Sartre's relationship to Altos Era? Was Altos Era the dogmatic,
No.
determinism?
The thing about Altos Era spent, a good time of his early adult life in a Stalag,
Mhm.
in a way. After the war, Altos Era, went to the École Normale. He's born 1918, Altos Era, but lived to be 1991. He died in 1990, I think 72 he was. And anyway, so he's once removed from Sartre's generation.
Okay, so he's
to
later.
me, this raises a great question, the problem of generations, which is an essay you should read by Karl Mannheim, because it talks about there are certain generations that we'll never come up to speed with, right? So the generation Mannheim's looking at is the generation that's educated from Sigmund Freud from the 1850s until about 1900. That is a long period, right? That ended up in Vienna, or ended up
Right.
in, the Lukács's, the Freud, all of this was a moment, late 19th century. Right? To me, the generation in France was 1900 to about 1915. These people that were, born during this period and were educated in the 1920s. Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Ferdinand Brundtland, I can go through the list, Marc Bloch, et cetera, Paul Nizam, et cetera. The moment of Picasso,
Right.
The moment of, all that, et cetera. So anyway, yes, so he's very much,
So Altos Era is not part of that generation.
who is?
Altos Era is not
No,
part of
Altos
that.
Era is not part of that generation. Altos Era comes up through a much more academically oriented, if you will, and also as a party member, where Sartre never really was.
Right.
Right, in a sense. So Altos Era what made Althusser's reputation, when Sartre is talking about subjectivity in 1961, and there's no documentation of this, the reason I know about it is Reggie Debray wrote that there was an argument at the Sorbonne that was between Sartre and Althusser, and Althusser supposedly cleaned Sartre's clock on the notion of dialectic. And this made a whole generation of students flock to Althusser, right? And he became, Louis Althusser at that moment, right? So 1962, we have the publication of Contradiction and Overdetermination, the lectures on Lenin and philosophy, and 1965 is when the Reading Capital Group starts publishing their research. Also, what's being created, 1964, is the Center for the Epistemological Circle, which had such luminaries as Jacques-Alain Millier, Lacan's son-in-law, all about Althusser and problems in epistemology. So you have another trace here in French academic people such as Louis Althusser.
Yeah.
Althusser is very close to Gaston Bachelard. The epistemological break is Bachelard's term, not Althusser's, right? Very important to remember that. And Georges Canquillan, the normal and the pathological, studies in the rationalities of science, is another trace in this, in a way, of which Foucault comes out of, Deleuze in a different way, etc. There are a lot of other people that we don't really, have as household names or domesticated names in the U.S. Academic life, in a sense. They become, kind of specialized. Victor Goldschmidt, another guy really worth reading on Plato, etc. Victor Jankovic on irony, and amazing thinkers that all contributed to the debate. Yeah, maybe I should do this. So there's Marital Garou, right? Spinoza and Descartes studies, who's excellent at commentary. Is one of them. Of course, Canquillan, Georges Canquillan, normal and the pathological, right? Another person. Georges Dumézil on how we begin to split up, how we basically work through paradigms, but then we divide them, in a certain way. He's very good at this. He did studies of Indo-European cultures, right? And Mithra Varunda on the Indian cultures. Very, very interesting book. Very influential on Foucault, these people. So anyway, so you get the notion of how to do a commentary from Garou. First-rate commentary on philosophical commentary, dense upon dense, right? Where you take a book like the Meditations, or you take a Meditations on First Philosophy of Descartes, and you write 300 pages of very good stuff that, if you're in the field, you respect, this kind of great ability. Something that's not really taught that much in the graduate schools here in philosophy. It's just advancing the thesis, but people don't really do this kind of level of commentary that the French do. It's analytic first and then synthetic. Whereas in Germany, you're synthesizing immediately, and building large totalities and senses of this, right? So anyway, so these are very important. And then of course, Jean Hippolyte, right? Studies in Hegel and Marx, who was known as the teacher to a lot of these people. That was Althusser's teacher, right? And some people may have read The Genesis and Structure of Hegel's Phenomenology. Magnificent book.
Got me through it.
Got you
Same
through.
here.
Same there, right? It's a great book, right? Yeah. He is the one who, in a sense, sensitized the whole generation of French intellectuals to the reading of Hegel, how to really do close reading. When Stanley says close reading, Hippolyte is the model, not Strauss and these kind of people, right? This is really close reading, this kind of sensitivity that he had. Pretty amazing stuff. Yeah, yeah. And he wrote a book on logic, on logic as well, on Hegel's logic, Logique et Existence, right? Very important. So he's also another one, in terms of the influences. So these are people that are not really, Genesis and Structure, of course, is taken up for people as introduction to Hegel, and a good introduction. And Hippolyte was, the seminars, going back to where Josh started here, Altos Era presented in Hippolyte's seminars, right? This is when he was coming up, and the first thing he shook up the French academic scene. He wrote a piece called Lenin and Philosophy. And it's important we take Lenin as a philosopher. And this was against, in some ways, the Colletti position that Lenin, Plekhanov, and a whole tradition of Marxists have misunderstood Marx on the dialectics. So this is kind of the narrative that's going on,
I see.
right? So you have these internal debates and schisms, obviously, that are going on, and but the main figures obviously are Kant. What are the conditions for the possibility of knowledge, and how do we ultimately look at this a priori? What are the a prioris of this, and how do we build a Marxist philosophy or a Marxist epistemology? Whereas Hegel is the other who basically has solved, right, the subject-object dichotomy, right, through the totality, etc. So this was sort of the background to all of this before Marx. The two major philosophers, of course, the German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, and German idealism, right? And of course, when Lenin says things, this is how dictums get started, you know how cults get started. Lenin says, no one who does not master Hegel's logic understand capital. So this is a dictum. So everybody and their grandmother starts rushing to read Hegel after that proposition gets out there. Colletti and Della Volpe and that school, and they're remnants of this in Altos Era too.
Yeah.
Go back to Kant, right? There's a return to Kant here in terms of look. We need to ground this epistemologically. We just can't say it's been solved by Hegel in a way. Okay? So what you have with Sartre is the Hegelian moment, right? He's very Hegelian in terms of totalizing and bringing many things into the totality and actually going beyond the subject-object into this other dimension, right, etc. But what he really is doing here in some ways, he becomes sort of the Kierkegaardian moment that Hegel solved everything and in terms of the objectivity, but one thing he left out was man himself, the subject, right? So this was where Sartre was really coming from, right, against the Eastern Marxism. Because all we've done, we haven't done any of the Eastern Marx. We didn't do Lenyov or any of these people. That's another tradition and probably another course. But in Western Marxism, right, this was, the mechanical, the automatic, all these things that are really being critiqued by the Western Marxism, especially the open-ended of Sartre. So he's trying to go against the Hegelian, tendency that solved everything but man. It's good to put the anthropological back into the equation. Okay? And this, of course, is predicated, I know you've heard this name before, and of course associated with the end of history, Kojève, right? Who was the other one with Hippolyte, the two great Hegelians of the pre-World War II, and Hippolyte's sense as an academic post-World War II that educated, a whole generation. I mean, really big time. I mean, you have to remember these were first-rate teachers, and they take this stuff extremely seriously. This is, yeah, and they understand philosophy and the relationship to the state. They understand this very well. We don't really talk about that in the States. If you go to philosophy program, they never really talk about the relationship to the State Department or the relationship to American ideology, or et cetera, et cetera. These are not things that are really on the table all the time. In Britain, you get some of it, right? In some ways, but not as in the UK. But in France, always the political moment of the philosophical discourse. Very, very important to remember this. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. English political economy, as Lenin said, right? German idealism and French, political thinking. And, So anyway, so to situate Sartre in a way is obviously not so difficult to do. Where he is situated with Marxism is he wants to bring back the question of, for lack of a better term, the individual or really subjectivity. is better put, right? And how Marxism has not really addressed this. So he says in Marxism and Existentialism that existentialism is a parasitic system that lives off the host, Marxism, right? But we need to look at this parasitic system because without it, right, we're going to lose the notion of subjectivity or that of the individual, right? It's just going to be class and, quote, the roll towards the classless society, right? So this is very important to keep in mind. So this is a working premise of existentialist Marxism. You do not begin with the essence of class position, class relations, or the essence of, quote, utopic speculation, etc. You begin with existence precedes essence. You begin with the phenomena of the subject, the self, whatever language you want to use. I mean, there are many debates on what kind of language. Do you want to talk about self as selbst in German? Do you want to talk about sujet, the subject, and the subjections that, say, Foucault will go through, right? Or the sujet-objet, the subject-object movement. But all to say, how to reorient this thinking about the existentialist, or existence precedes essence, which is a very, very radical position in a sense, because when you begin to think about this, how do you get away from essentializing, tendencies? You begin with that person's existence. You don't say, what's your class? What's your race? What's your background? You deal with the phenomena as it unfolds. And this he picks up, obviously, from Husserlian phenomenology and also Heideggerian Dasein, in a way, the there being of the subject, the orientation of the subject, which is, I think, something that's really been lacking in any kind of real discussion. In a sense, the Occupy movement, at least to my mind, didn't really address the question. This was a question of existence. It wasn't just a question of class struggle, right? I mean, which is a question of existence, but it only framed it as the 1%. It didn't say our existence is at stake. It began to start speaking to the environmental concerns, the, days, everyday life, and all of this. So anyway, again, the starting point, and to make a connection between Sartre and Lefebvre, they both started everyday life, like Heidegger. Heidegger is the first to do this in 20th century philosophy. How do we get back to everyday life? How do we begin to, think this through? What is the there-ness, the orientation of the subject? Why are we bringing all this baggage and prejudicial thinking? It's very hard to do. You think about this, it's much more difficult. It's much easier to have the automatic categories to roll with, right? In a sense, it's much more difficult to suspend one's judgment, to critique one's prejudicial, prejudgmental thinking, right? What are that, and examine that and see things as they are and build from there. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. And this, to me, is one of Sartre's great contributions, is that phrase, from existentialism is a humanism. We claim existentialism as existence precedes essence, right? Right? Existence precedes essence, right? Right? Very important to keep that in mind. And, how you cannot get to essentialist thinking, which maybe Kant engages in terms of how the categories are created. So there are many levels to this, and of course, Hegel too, ultimately, that, in the spheres of religion, art, and philosophy, they're overlapping with each other, but you essentialize at each level to get to a higher stage. So Sartre is, even though his mind is, about consciousness and intentionality always, and it's a very high consciousness. Levi-Strauss once remarked after their debate, this is civilization and this is Jean-Paul Sartre, which was very, very nice, friendly. Levi-Strauss is a clever man. But anyway, so I forgot to mention him as part of this, tradition. But, another great thinker and major contribution. So anyway, So Sartre wants to bring this in, and there are passages here. I don't know if you, again, did you have time to read it or look at it? Yeah, good.
I read it.
Any thoughts or questions so far? Because I mean, I marked a few things that are interesting. He begins. Maybe we can go to the text a little bit, and then we can come back to Lefebvre, and then maybe retrospectively to the Italians. He says philosophy really doesn't exist, it's only ideology, right? Yep. And he talks about Marxism as on page 4, at least in this text, Marxism and Existentialism.
Search for a method.
Search for a method, questions of method, problem of method, yeah. Right, he goes through the stages that philosophy is first of all a particular way in which the rising class becomes conscious of itself. Right? Very interesting, right? The rising class becomes so Cartesianism is the rising class of manufacturing, mercantile capitalism becoming conscious of itself. For those of you interested in this subject, obviously Negre wrote Political Descartes. Very interesting study of Descartes and his relationship to the quest for certainty and the manufacturing epoch. Very, very interesting attempt, right? So consciousness can be clear or confused, indirect or direct, and at the time of the noblesse des robes and of mercantile, a bourgeois of lawyers, merchants, and bankers gained a certain self-awareness. So he's saying that self-consciousness has a historicity. And this is Gramsci, really at work, where we did very early in this course, going back to Gramsci, as always historically situating the ideas, that philosophy is not so thin. It's the second page of the of Marxism and Existentialism, right? So a bourgeois, manufacturers, engineers, and scientists dimly discovered itself in the image of universal man, which Kantianism, offered to it, right? So the universal in Kant, so he's going to take. But if it is to be truly philosophical, this mirror must be presented as the totalization or totalization of contemporary knowledge. And he capitalizes knowledge for a reason, because this is what Marxism claims, Yeah. Science, right? It's science. The philosopher affects the unification of everything that is known, follows certain guiding schemata which expresses the attitudes and techniques of the rising class regarding its own period and its world. Later, when the details of this knowledge have been, one by one, challenged, destroyed by the advance of learning, the overall concept will still remain as an undifferentiated content. These achievements of knowing, after having first been bound by principles, will in turn, crushed and almost indecipherable, bind together the principles. Reduced to its simplest expression, the philosophical object will remain in the objective mind in the form of a regulative idea, this is Kant, right, pointing to the infinite task. That's also Husserl. Thus in France one speaks of the Kantian idea, or in Germany of Fichte's Weltanschauung, worldviews. This is because a philosophy, when it is at the height of its power, is never presented as something inert, as the passive, already terminated unity of knowledge. Born from the movement of society, it is itself a movement, and it acts upon the future. This concrete totalization is at the same time the abstract project of pursuing the unification up to its final limits. And in this sense, philosophy is characterized as a method of investigation and explication. The confidence which it has in itself and its future development merely reproduces the certitudes of the class which supports it. Every philosophy is practical, even the one which at first seems to be the most contemplative. Okay? So the vita contemplative, and the Aristotelian distinction between theoretical and practice is being broken down here. The activa, vita activa is no longer contemplative vita, activa. Its method is a social and a political weapon. Okay? The analytical, critical rationalism of the great Cartesians has survived them, born from conflict, and looked back to clarify the conflict. at the time when the bourgeoisie sought to undermine the institutions of the ancien regime, it attacked the outworn significations which tried to justify them. You know, and he's speaking here, of course, you know, about Rousseau and others, right? And how they did this, right? The post-Cartesianism. Later, it gives service to liberalism, and it provided a doctrine of procedures that attempted to realize the atomization of the proletariat. You know, the dignity of work.
Okay.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Thus, yeah.
He's
But do you understand what he's doing? I mean, this is
Yeah.
very interesting as a background to show that philosophy is always, you know, connected to the ascending class, you know, and you know, it becomes part of the ideology, which he's getting from Nizam. In Nizam's little book, Monthly Review published it years ago, called The Watchdogs, Philosophers in the Established Order. It's a very interesting attempt to look at how philosophy contributes to the status quo and the justification of the status quo. Okay? So this philosophy remains efficacious so long as the praxis, and he uses a Gramscian word and an Aristotelian word, right, which has engendered it, which supports it, and which is clarified, is still alive, as long as the praxis is alive. So we still live in the shadow, if you will, of Cartesianism, especially in the medical profession. All the stuff we talk about, big pharma, psychochemistry, you know, pharmaceutical, all these things are still remnants of the Cartesian worldview, part of that praxis. It's part of allopathic medicine. We have not transferred, we do so in terms of these green cash economies. I like to call it green cash. You go to the health food stores, you're paying double the price. You know, who's to know they don't spray with insecticides next to it, you know, in a sense. I mean, that's what organic means, right? I'm not there on the farm, but I'm paying double the price to see organic on the label, right? Anyway, all to say, this is a remnant of Cartesianism and allopathic, you know, medicine, right? And you know, versus, you know, homeopathic. So in this way, Cartesianism in the 18th century appears under two indissoluble and complementary aspects, and we could talk about this today as well. On the one hand, as the idea of reason, so Cartesianism becomes French rationalism. You know, Descartes is the one who writes the discourse on the method for rightly conducting one's reasons in science, one's reason in the sciences, right, and the production of knowledge. And on the other hand is an analytical moment, right? It inspires Holbach, Helvetius, Diderot, and Rousseau. And then it is Cartesianism, which we also find at the source of anti-religious pamphlets, as well as the mechanistic materialism, right? On the other hand, it passes into anonymity and conditions the attitudes of the Third Estate. See, very smart, this guy. You know, when you begin. In each case, universal, analytical reason vanishes and reappears in the form of spontaneity. This means that the immediate response of the oppressed to oppression will be critical. Right? The abstract revolt precedes the French Revolution and armed insurrection by some years. Right? But the directed violence of weapons will overthrow privileges which have already been dissolved in reason. So this is interesting. Philosophy as, you know, anterior, you know, if you will, as anticipating, right, the struggle, as a weapon of the revolution, as a critical weapon of the revolution. And this is interesting the way he sees it, right? So things go so far that the philosophical mind crosses the boundaries of the bourgeoisie and infiltrates the ranks of the populace. This is the moment at which the French bourgeoisie claims it is a universal class. The infiltrations of its philosophy will permit it to mask the struggles which are beginning to split the Third Estate and will allow it to find a language and common gestures for all revolutionary classes. If philosophy is to be simultaneously a totalization of knowledge and a method and a regulative idea, Hegel, Cartesianism, Kant, an offensive weapon, Marx, and a community of language, if this vision of the world is also an instrument which ferments rotten societies, if this particular concept of a man or of a group of men becomes the culture and sometimes the nature of the whole class, then it is very clear that the periods of philosophical creation are rare. Very interesting, right? And again, you hear the echoes of Gramsci here. Sartre claims he didn't read Gramsci until the 70s. But he must have been aware of some of this movement, I mean, the people talk, whether he read them or not, I'm sure that was part of the conversation. Between the 17th century and the 20th, I see three such periods which I designate by the names of the men who dominated them. Now, this is different than Gramsci, who wants to deal with just the ideas. He doesn't want to use proper names so much. So I'm thinking out loud here, if you will, about how would one go about rewriting a history of philosophy from a materialistic, Marxist standpoint. How would one go about the rewriting process that's more true to the moment? So for Sartre, there is the moment of Descartes and Leibniz, a moment. That of Descartes and Locke, that of Kant and Hegel, and finally that of Marx. Okay, so this is all from the period. Philosophy does not really, of our period, begins in the 17th century. Yeah, the Copernican revolution is where we begin. We don't begin with the ancients or really deal with the medievals. He's talking about the epoch of capitalism, if you will, right? Or what, the Heideggerian, histories of being people. We'll talk about being, as self-consciousness, the last stage, right? Self-awareness becomes part of our moment in the 17th century, and then it's articulated and culminates in Hegel's self-consciousness and consciousness in general in the master-slave dialectic, and that becomes the end of philosophy. That Hegel terminates philosophy, and then of course Marx comes and overturns that, in his way, right? Okay, so these three philosophies become the hummus of every particular thought and the horizon of all culture. There's no going beyond them so long as man has not gone beyond the historical moment in which they express. So in a strange way, we live in feudal society because of the nominalism that's going on and this kind of, induced, if you will, slavery, indentured servitude, where people live in this kind of feudal relation to the boss and to the economy at one level. We also live in a Cartesianism vis-a-vis the allopathic medicine and, sometimes lack of self-awareness. We may not even be at the Copernican turn. And at another level, we're living in an age of digitalization, right? Which is kind of a return to this feudalism, a new nominalism, new naming for the new digital economy. Send me a texto, they say in French, I need a texto, right? This is a new language. This is a new kind of culture at work. It's not a text like this, textures, right? Texto, electronic digitalization at work. So we're living in these all these levels, these periods that are very much still in the 17th century. And remember, the 17th century is the advent of the adding machine, the new mathematics that allows for capitalism, right? Deductive and inductive reasoning, Bacon in terms of the scientific method in Novum Organum, and Descartes in terms of the deductive systems of the Cartesian logic, right? We doubt everything until we find out we are the only certain factor in all of this. It is the subjectivity of the self. This is what Cartesian liberty ultimately is. So it's interesting the way he does this, right? It's a sort of different moment, right? Okay, so then he goes on. I often remarked on the fact that the anti-Marxist argument is the only apparent rejuvenation of a pre-Marxist idea. That's interesting, right? So he's temporally sealing this. Anytime you bring up something anti-Marxist, it's a pre-Marxist idea that you're bringing up. So if we criticize against these political I know I'm harping on this today, but anyway, the tax code, right? We want to go back to a progressive income tax, right? In a way, is a previous idea, it's a preconceived idea of the Eisenhower years. What happened in the Eisenhower year? The rich got richer. What did they figure out? How to do tax loopholes. It opened up a whole new group of lawyers that were able to figure out, there are oil partnerships you can invest in. There's an oil depletion allowance. You can deduct 90% of your money. We're going to guarantee you 20% of that 90% deduction, and you're going to become much richer under the new tax laws, even though they're saying they're going to take 91% of your income, right? In a sense. So this is not out there in a sense of, it's an anti-Marxist moment because it's not really looking at the comprehensive, where the future really is. It is an attempt to go back to the past, right? It's an early idea, So really, in a way, Bernie Sanders is pre-New Deal with a few of the New Deal rhetoric, right? I mean, I'm not, listen, again, it's something. That's not what I'm not trying to, just scapegoat that or do it. But I mean, I think we should understand this as educated people and what that future, would be about, in terms of we really took this philosophy and, struggles and antagonism and ideology and this kind of thinking, So anyway, at best, only the rediscovery of a thought already contained in the philosophy one believes one has gone beyond, right? As far as for revisionism, this is either a truism or an absurdity. There's no need to readapt a living philosophy to the course of the world. It adapts itself by means of thousands of new efforts, thousands of particular pursuits, for the philosophy is at one with the movement of society. So, he's one of the few to say this. Wittgenstein, of course, is, trying to solve all the problems of philosophy by going into the language games, right? The private language argument. Sartre is saying, look, as a Marxist, we need to take into account the Mitsein, the social world, right, etc., and this movement. Much more Gramsci influenced than, quote, some of the advances in, analytical philosophy going back to Frege, And, we should do a course and, on Frege to Wittgenstein and beyond. It's important. It's another aspect here. But in a way, to me, this is more powerful in terms of the social and the political and that movement. Okay? So these people who believe themselves to be the most faithful spokespeople for their predecessors transform the thoughts which they want simply to repeat. Right? And you can see this as a compulsion to repeat in terms of this new generation, right? Methods are modified because they're applied to new objects, right? If this movement on the part of philosophy no longer exists, one of two things is true. Either the philosophy is dead or it's going through a crisis. In the first case, there's no question of revising, but of raising a rotten building. In the second case, the philosophical crisis is the particular expression of a social crisis. So he's beginning to see this as what Altos Era will call, in Hegelian terms, the expressive totality. Altos Era will talk about that there's a totality that expresses itself, but it is separate from what he calls the structural totality, is where the base superstructure relations are playing out. So expressive totality for Altos Era becomes more of a symptom. For Sartre, it is part of the movement, right? Much more Hegelian, right? Okay? Its immobility is conditioned by the contradictions which split the society. This is another thing we don't think really like good Hegelians, right? In terms of the logic of the contradiction. Where are the contradictions today? What is really going on? People are very afraid of living in those contradictions and unmasking them, right? And unmasking them. And polemics that go with this. I was asked to leave a union meeting, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave because I was engaged in polemics. Can you imagine? Yeah, this is in a union meeting. You can imagine what it would be in the corporate boardrooms, right? So anyway, revision performed by experts would be therefore the idealist mystification without real significance. It is the very movement of history, and remember, history is always capitalized. Marx, we know of one science, and that is of history. That's the science. Historical materialism is considered by Marx to be a science. With its philosophical arm is dialectical materialism, whatever that means. We don't want to get reductionistic in terms of the Stalinist position, which is not so stupid if you read it, but it's, it's not as bad as, people just dismiss it. But anyway, on Diamat, right, dialectical materialism. It is the very movement of history, the struggle of men on all planes, emphasis on struggle, and on levels of human activity which will set free captive thought and permit it to attain its full development. Those intellectuals who came after the great flowering and who undertake to set the systems in order to use the new methods to conquer territory not yet fully explored, those who provide practical applications to the theory and employ it as a tool to destroy and to construct, they should not be called philosophers. They cultivate the domain. They take an inventory. You hear Gramsci echoed here too, taking an inventory, first part of the study of philosophy in the prison notebooks that were read from. They erect certain structures there. They may even bring about certain internal, but they still get their nourishment from the living thought of the great dead. They are borne along by the crowd on the margin. It is the crowd which constitutes their cultural milieu and their future and determines the field of their investigations and even of their creations. These relative men, I propose to call ideologists. So right away, he's separating the philosophers from the ideology, right? And since I'm to speak of existentialism, let it be understood that I speak of it here as an ideology. This is a brilliant introduction, by the way. I mean, this is a first-class writer, in my opinion. I mean, this is a dialectical mind at work. That if you start engaging this, you're going to be provoked to thinking. You might not agree. I'm not saying become Sartrean, but this is a first-class, steel-trap dialectical mind at work, right? The way he frames things, right? It is a parasitical system, right? Living on the margin of knowledge. And anytime it's capitalized here, Marxist epistemology and history. History and epistemology are capitalized throughout. Which at first it opposed, by which today it seems to be integrated. If we to understand its present ambitions and function, we must go back, and this is where he starts, Kierkegaard. And he gave, the interesting thing about Sartre, he wrote a very good piece after he wrote this called Kierkegaard and the Singular Individual. And it's worth reading too, because it actually brings up the question of singularity, in terms of subjectivity. Very, very interesting. That, as Kierkegaard said, Hegel solved everything except the problem of where is man in the system, right? So truth is subjectivity for Kierkegaard, And one of the great things, the concluding unscientific postscript is one of the great things that Kierkegaard did in terms of where he left open the question of where is the individual in all of this. And Kierkegaard wanted, I'm not in agreement with Kierkegaard about a lot of things, but anyway, one thing that was interesting, on his tombstone, he wanted written, that individual. That's it, right? That individual, right? I'm like Billy the Kid, sleep with one eye open. I want to sleep with both eyes open. It's better. Yeah. But anyway, the most ample philosophical totalization is Hegelianism, and you can see he begins to talk about this because he's addressing the Marxist Hegelianism and the Cogent. You want to look? Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I see you. Yeah. Yeah. And we're on page 8 in that book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Here, knowledge is raised to its most eminent dignity. So we have to send Sherrod Brown. Knowledge and eminent dignity instead of work. Right? It is not limited to viewing being from the outside. Interesting, right? It incorporates being and dissolves it in itself. Mind objectifies itself, alienates itself, and rediscovers itself without ceasing. That's part of the Hegelian dialectic and the unfolding of the system. Man externalizes himself. He loses himself in things, but every alienation is surmounted by the absolute knowledge of the philosopher. That's the Hegelian project, is to come full circle to absolute knowing. I, Hegel, am the truth. I, Hegel, am God. Right? Ultimately. Right? This is really what the entire phenomenology. If you go through the journey of the phenomenology, you begin to see these spheres unfolding, etc., where the absolute knowing becomes achieved at the end. And from Marx and both Freud get, there's no royal road to science. But those who are not afraid of climbing its real heights, will gain access to the great vision, so to speak. Okay? So anyway, thus those cleavages, those contradictions which cause our unhappiness, and he's playing on, by the way, Jean Val, another philosopher that is part of this moment of that generation, wrote the book called The Unhappy Consciousness. Jean Val, 1929, he wrote on the unhappy consciousness, and an early thinker, friend of Kojève and Leo Strauss, actually. Yeah. Which are posited in order to make it. We are not only knowers. In the triumph of intellectual consciousness, we appear as the known. We are not only the known and the knower and the known. And if you remember the diagram I did last time on Plato's theories of forms, the idea there is to be the knower and the known. When we did this last time we were in this room.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, the lived aspect of a tragic experience, a suffering unto death, is absorbed by the system as a relatively abstract determination which must be mediated as a passage towards the absolute, which is the only genuine concrete. So this is an explication of Hegel. Very good capsule summary, if you will, of Hegel, I think. Yeah. And a long footnote here of Hippolyte, and studies in Marx and Hegel in the footnote. Compared with Hegel, then, Kierkegaard scarcely seems to count. He is certainly not a philosopher. He himself even refused this title. In fact, he is a Christian. Who is not willing to let himself be enclosed in the system, and who, against Hegel's intellectualism, asserts unrelentingly the irreducibility and the specificity of what is lived. So Sartre has a great term, vécu, right? Lived experience, right? This is what he's really trying to get to. Yeah. That Marxism, as he knows it, an automatic Marxism, has covered up the lived experience, our actual lived experience. And we talked a little bit, if you remember when I was doing Erlebnis and Erfahrung earlier, when we were looking at Lukács in terms of experience, basically what's going on, and I think Adorno is really much about this in the negative dialectics, is how do we get back to really lived experience? We're so covered up by all this stuff, all these level of mediations. How do we get back to this unmediated subjectivity? How do we really, deconstruct, delayer these moments? So this is a very, very interesting thing that Sartre's really trying to get to here. I think. Are we really living? That's another thing. Or, and this is part of the Cartesian moment when Descartes says, how do I know those human beings aren't automatons out in the street? And in a way, we really look at this. I mean, I go into the train, I can predict out of 80 people, 73 people on that car in the train or on the phones. I mean, this is automism at work, right? It's psychic automism. Constantly, you just see it time and time again. And he has a great category against this lived experience, serial thinking, that he plays out in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Serial thinking. We think in terms of series, right? We see serially. We don't really experience, right? We're only perceiving serially. So it's very, very interesting in that regard. Okay, so anyway, and then he uses Jean Wall. He's a Christian, asserts there's no doubt, as Wall has remarked, that Hegelian would have assimilated this romantic and obstinate consciousness to the unhappy consciousness, that Kierkegaard is part of that unhappy consciousness, a moment which has already been surpassed and known in its essential characteristics. But it's precisely the subjective knowledge which Kierkegaard actually challenges. For him, the surpassing of the unhappy consciousness remains purely verbal. The existing man cannot be assimilated by a series of ideas or a system of ideas. So this is very much going back to intuitive essences, to a Wesenschauen in terms of understanding the objects in the world, and at the same time our experience in doing so. This return to subjectivity in a way. Whatever one may say or think about suffering, it escapes knowledge to the extent that it suffered in itself, for itself, to the degree that the knowledge remains powerless to transform it. The philosopher constructs a palace of ideas and lives in a hovel. Kierkegaard, by the way, if you haven't read him, he's a great writer. He's a great dialectical thinker. He is a Christian, no question about it, in a sense, but in some ways, the writing is magnificent. And Fear and Trembling is worth reading because he makes the distinction that Heidegger takes up later, that fear is always of an object, right? Whereas anxiety is objectless. And all these people that say they're anxious, and then the therapist says, what are you anxious about? It's a stupid question, because anxiety has no object. It has no, it's not about a narrative. You say, what am I fearful about, would be a better question. At least to the philosophical, to these distinctions that are making. I'm not, yeah. If it helps, whatever works, so I get you through the night, but anyway, so to speak. All right, so of course it is a religion which Kierkegaard wants to defend. Hegel was not willing for Christianity to be surpassed, but for this very reason he made it the highest moment of human existence, absolute knowing and the desire to be God. Sartre has a great proposition. Man is a useless passion because he desires to be God. It's a very interesting proposition. Man is a useless passion. Useless passion because of the desire to become God. In a way, this is a swipe at Hegel, too, right? And at that tradition. Okay? So, Kierkegaard, on the other hand, insists on the transcendence of the divine between man and God. He puts an infinite distance. The existence of the omnipotent cannot be the object of an objective knowledge. It becomes the aim of a subjective faith, right? And this faith, in turn, with its strength and its spontaneous affirmation, will never be reduced to a moment which can be surpassed and classified to a knowledge. So this is against epistemology in a certain way, Kierkegaard. And it's no accident that Adorno began his dissertation, as did Lukács, his early thinking, both with Kierkegaard. It's very interesting. Kierkegaard, Construction of an Aesthetic, worth reading. Adorno, of course, talks about the bourgeois interior. And, of course, Lukács, The Soul in Its Forms, is an early engagement with Soren Kierkegaard. I'm not advocating for it, please don't hear me that way, but I think it's a very brilliant mind. It's one of the great minds of the 19th century, Soren Kierkegaard. Yeah. I mean, he had a great book called The Present Age. This is the age of advertisement and publicity. Nothing really happens. Interesting, right? In terms of temporality, nothing really happens, he says. This is his transcendent notion of time, right? Anyway, okay, so, stubbornly asserts itself against scientific evidence despite the scandal. He looks everywhere for weapons to aid him in escaping from the terrible mediation. He discovers within himself oppositions, indecisions, equivocations which cannot be surpassed, paradoxes, ambiguities, discontinuities, and dilemmas. In all these inward conflicts, Hegel doubtless would see only contradiction in formation or in the process of development. So he's taking on the methodology here, but this is exactly what Kierkegaard reproaches him for, even before becoming aware of them. The philosopher of Jena would not have decided to consider them truncated ideas. In fact, the subjective life, just insofar as lived, can never be made the object of knowledge. It's interesting, right? On principle, it escapes knowing, and the relation of the believer to transcendence can only be conceived in the form of the going beyond. This inwardness, in all its narrowness and its infinite depth, claims to affirm itself against all philosophy, the subjectivity rediscovered beyond language as the personal adventure of each man in the face of others and of God. This is what Kierkegaard called existence. Okay? We see that Kierkegaard is inseparable from Hegel, and that vehement negation of every system can arise only within a cultural field dominated by Hegelianism. The Dane feels himself hemmed in by concepts, by history. He fights for his life. It is the reaction of Christian romanticism against the rationalistic humanization of fate. It would be too easy to reject this work as simply subjectivism. What we ought rather to point out, and this is where he becomes good, placing it back within the framework of this period, is that Kierkegaard has just as much right on his side as Hegel has on his. Hegel is right, unlike the Danish ideologist, who ostensibly fixed his stand on the pure frozen paradoxes, ultimately referring to as an empty subjectivity. The philosopher Genus aims through his concepts at the variable concrete. For him, mediation is always presented as an enrichment. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, is right. Grief, need, passion, the pain of men are brute realities which can never be surpassed nor changed by knowledge. To be sure, Kierkegaard's religious subjectivism can, with good reason, be taken as the very peak of idealism. But in relation to Hegel, he marks a progress towards realism, since he insists above all on the primacy of the real over thought. Interesting, huh? If this right-wing Hegelianism, I don't mean right-wing in the Falwellian, Mike Pence sense, or Trumpian, but right in terms of its, still believing, right? Still has a notion of transcendence going on with it, right? Has a privilege of the real over thought, So you have here a very interesting moment in the history of philosophy, or what Sartre would say, there are no philosophy, only ideologies, the ideologies of rationalism, the ideology of Hegelianism. You have this primacy of the real coming back in that also takes place, right? From Romanticism from the Enlightenment to Romanticism to modernity, right? And then this way. That the real cannot be reduced to thought, which is what Hegel does ultimately, Yeah? The real is the rational and the rational is the real, but it's the rational of the thought that becomes the real, right? And as most of you know, the real is the rational and the rational of the real was one justification for the fascistic state. If the state becomes the highest order of the Hegelian projection. That's one reading of Hegel. I'm not saying that that's the only reading, but that's certainly something that was used by anti-Hegelian thinking. And also, Sidney Hook, as an American Marxist, went that way often as well. All right, so today some psychologists consider certain evolutions of our inward light to be the result of a work which it performs upon itself. In this sense, Kierkegaardian existence is the work of our inner life, resistance overcome and perpetually reborn. Efforts perpetually renewed, despair surmounted, provisional failures and precarious victories, and this work is directly opposed to intellectual knowing. Kierkegaard was the first to point out against Hegel, and thanks to him, the incommensurability of the real and knowledge. This is interesting, right? Again, that this incommensurability may be the origin of a conservative irrationalism, and this is speaking to Lukács here, in a way, destruction of reason. It is even one of the ways in which we may understand this ideologist's writing, but it can be seen also as the death of absolute idealism. Ideas do not change men. Knowing the cause of a passion is not enough to overcome it. One must live it, one must oppose it, and other passions to it. One must combat it tenaciously. In short, one must, and I like this phrase, work oneself over. Not only work through something, right, but work oneself over. Interesting. Sartre liked boxing, by the way. Yeah. He and Norman Mailer had that in common. Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, how does that go along with his phrase about man is a useless passion when he's...
Well, man is a
Saying
useless
you have
passion
to-
because of the desire to become God. Man is just not a useless passion by itself. Man is a useless passion in the fact that the desire is to become God,
And that's
right?
not- that's
Instead
not-
of to become human.
So that's not a passion you can work through.
Yeah, he used to say, they asked him at the end of his life, very good interview with Sartre about a year before he died. Forgot the name of the interviewer, French woman, and asked him, you seem to have a Pascalian wager. He says, the difference between me and Pascal is Pascal wagered on God, I wager on man. Right? So this was a very interesting thing, that he's really waging, again, this is really a culmination, and I know I've put this term up, and, we can, when we do record, if you come to the Freud stuff, we'll talk more about this. But this is the culmination of philosophical anthropology, right? Which I think will go through maybe a renaissance soon, yeah. Come back around, yeah. I mean, It seems to me that we're so far away from each, that this anthropology. So this is the anthropological reaching its moment, right? This was certainly criticized by the Heideggerians and certainly by, the Derridians, it smacks of philosophical anthropology. It's still projections, it's not enough of the quote objective reality. So this is something that's come back into play. So Sartre becomes one of the great last representatives of this moment, right?
And what aspect of what Sartre's saying relates to philosophical anthropology?
Man is a useless passion because of his desire to become God, right, in a way. And also, the limit is man as an end. The telos is really man, right? I mean, I'm using the gender, but this is the way he spoke, right? Yeah. The subject is the end, right? Not the religious, not eternity and all this. Yeah, Feuerbach is really, it is a kind of Feuerbachian moment as well, yeah.
It's interesting that you said Derrida too, because he also returns to Kierkegaard, right? And the instant of the decision is madness. That
Yes.
whole sort of unreadability moment is also kind of a Kierkegaard thing.
Yes, that's true. I mean, Cartesianism, the debate between Derrida and Foucault on the cogito and the history of madness is really about that instant of decision. Is Descartes completely mad when he discovers self-consciousness, right? And then is Kierkegaard in the leap of faith in that instant of madness as well, right?
To get back
And
to
his
the real,
decision
right, yeah.
itself, an instance of madness, because decisive is a cut away from something else, And people have a very hard time. I'm going through this, in different ways right now. But very difficult time just to make decisions, to make cuts. It's very strange, that this is happening. But you see this, and people hold on. They hold on. The clinging, the whole thing. And in a way, again. Look, politically, this has at least some kind of, it plays out symptomatically politically. Instead of saying it's revolution or nothing, right? I mean, in a way, that's really the wager, right? That reformism, unless it's a revolutionary reformism, is not really worth talking about, not really worth, building the energy. That the hard work is really in that kind of revolutionary consciousness. People will cling. Let's take a tax program from the 50s. Let's take this policy of a work's progress, the dignity of work. Let's do a new WPA, right? Et cetera. Jobs. We want jobs. What kind of stupid slogan is that to march for we want jobs? No, we want, we want prosperity Marxism. It's what we want, right? So anyway, I mean, again, to think this through, again, it's the limit. The telos is man himself, right? In a way. Right, in this sense, right? So this is what they're getting back. So this is atheistic existentialism alongside of atheistic Marxism, right? It's the interesting thing about Camus, he always said that he's anti-theist. He never believed in God, et cetera. An anti-theist moment, why even, go there? In Sartre's case, it's atheism because he wants to do historically this whole history, And remember, France is a very Catholic country. That's another thing. And the battle between the Huguenots and the Catholics, pretty massive struggles, over the years. So there are stakes here that are obviously very, very, active. So anyway, so working oneself over is a great phrase. And again, going back to this thing about philosophical anthropology, Feuerbach, as you said, is a precursor here. The essence of Christianity is man himself, right? It's a projection of God, a sensuous projection, a kind of sensuous rationalism in this way, all right? So, but you have Feuerbach, who was taken up by the left, and then you have Kierkegaard, who's now being taken up by a left Sartrean, in a way, right? And so the Feuerbachian tradition was played out in Marxism, was a Kierkegaardian tradition, only Lukács early on, Adorno early on, Sartre, etc. Right? Interesting. So Nietzsche and Kierkegaard were actually two, philosophers not really known to the tradition, to the Marxist tradition. If you look at the tradition with Labriola, with Engels, Engels' book on the German idealism, Ludwig Feuerbach and German classical philosophy, right? It was one of the first attempts. Plekhanov's 5 volumes on philosophy, of which very indebted to Spinoza, Plekhanov, right? And then of course, the tradition that played this out. So you're not getting great studies of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard out of the Soviet Union. You're getting some good studies on dialectics, on the theories of contradiction, but you're not getting any studies of these kind of figures, right? Yeah. And then you have open-ended Kantianism like Bakhtin, who's interesting, in terms of the formation of the chronotope, but that's only going on in literary studies, and they have a very rich tradition in that, right? Yeah. So anyway, we can return there too. Okay, so it's striking that Marxism addresses the same reproach to Hegel, but from another point of view. And this is a clever mind at work. You can see the perceptual, just in these 4 pages, the shifts, right? Now he's going to go to the point of view of Marxism, parallel to that of Kierkegaard, right, to Hegel. Hegel has confused objectification, the simple externalization of man in the universe, with the alienation that turns his externalization back against man. Taken by itself, Marx emphasizes again and again, objectification would be an opening out. It would allow man, who produces and reproduces his life without ceasing, and who transforms himself by changing nature, to contemplate himself in a world in which he created. No dialectical sleight of hand can make alienation come out of it. This is why what is involved here is not a play of concepts, but real history. And then he cites Marx too in the Grundrisse introduction, the preface to the contribution, Political Economy, right? The totality of the relations of production, etc., constitutes the real foundation upon which a legal and political superstructure arises, and to which definite forms of social consciousness correspond. Of course, this is a classic, extract from Marx, always worth thinking through, in terms of base superstructure relations, etc. Okay, now, in the present phase of our history, productive forces have entered in conflict with relations of production, and we're beginning to see this in the technological, how our social relations have changed radically because of the shift in the, productive forces of production, right? The more and more we get this, how we, dominated by, we've got to check our inner email, we've got to check our texts, we've got to check this, etc. This is setting up new forms of social relations, of which, again, I advocate for him, Bernard Stiegler. Maybe we can bring him to Left Forum. He's very good on this stuff in Technics and Time and in critique of symbolic misery and all of this. Okay, so anyway, creative work is alienated. Man does not reckon himself as in a product, and in his exhausting labor experience feels to him to be a hostile force. We can send this to Sherrod Brown too, right? Since alienation comes about as the result of this conflict, it is a historical reality and completely irreducible to an idea. So you can see what's playing out here is this opposition, obviously, between Vécu, lived experience, and idea. Between idea and ideatum, right? The object and the idea. All of these things that are problematized somewhat as early as Plato. With all due respect to, Whitehead, who said, all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. I mean, tongue in cheek. Anyway, if men are to free themselves from it, and if their work is to become the pure objectification of themselves, it is not enough that consciousness thinks itself. So this is against Hegel. There must be material work and revolutionary praxis, right? When Marx writes, just as we do not judge an individual by his own idea of himself, so we cannot judge a period of revolutionary upheaval by its own self-consciousness. So we can always be the smartest kids on the block, the greatest avant-garde, always. Not going to do us any good without material force. Yeah, in a way, yeah. This is why, you need thinking always from the ground of revolutionary consciousness, yeah. Look what happened to Syriza. I mean, this was a major disappointment. I mean, I never had a major appointment with him, but it was a major disappointment because I thought they had much more. This is one of the biggest compromised formations in the history of Western, insurrection. They had the moment in their hands. at the moment, you know? They're not taken. They missed a major historical moment, and now they're just pawns of the EU and holding on for dear life. Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's his face there in Canada, York?
Trudeau.
No, our friend from, oh God, I can't.
Leo Panich,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Panich is saying we've gotta support Syriza.
still,
Oh,
no.
he still says that.
He still says
Oh,
that.
God's sake.
He's
I'm gonna
still
see him.
saying
I'm
that.
gonna see him in Greece maybe this
Please,
summer.
okay,
I'm
yeah.
gonna talk to him.
Ask him.
I will.
No, I just read a thing. that-
He's still supported.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of his students, who's a good friend of mine, Michael Mikhailis Spordalaikis, who is the dean of the Athens School of political economy or politics and social philosophy, is still a member of the party, but is very critical, but is still a member of the party. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he and Lapavitsas don't talk.
Yeah.
I actually think Lapavitsas was much smarter during this period. Whether he had the right solution, but his critique was there. And if you want, you should look at the conference. It's on YouTube. It's a very good thing when Lapavitsas speaks. It's Panich, Sam Gindin, Kostas Douzinas, and Stathis Gugarakis from Columbia University. The four of them on the panel, and then Lapavitsas, 5 of them, at the Syriza thing, after the no vote, you know, et cetera, and Syriza's backing off, et cetera, and making the deal with the Troika. And yeah, so it's on YouTube. You put it down, you know, Syriza conference, 2000, summer of 2000, and what was it, 15, right? Yeah, and it's great because Lapavitsas just gets up, and Lapavitsas is a boxer, by the way. He likes boxing like Naylor and Sartre. Anyway, he's a tough guy. He's got broken nose. You can see he's got the green. I have a little bit of broken nose too.
He and Varoufakis could go out.
Right. Well, the thing is, it's funny because they said Golden Dawn likes to box, and Lapavitsas says we're going to have boxing contacts. You know, I'm ready for them. Bring them all on. It's funny. But anyway, he was good. He was really the best of the group. Douzinas is up here with some Walter Benjamin stuff out of the blue. You know, Panich is so kind of, as Phil was saying, supportive. You know, Gindin's trying to keep order because the Greeks, they go for the throat. You know, you don't go to, it's not nice civil society at these conferences. They start yelling. You know, in the crowd. So you'll see this in the thing. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's on Real News. You know, Demetrius Laskalis, who is a very good guy from Toronto, a lawyer and a militant. He's the one who put it together. Yeah, yeah. You know? Yeah.
Well, I've seen him
Yeah,
many
yeah.
times. He's
Yeah.
an environmental lawyer,
Yeah,
I think, in
yeah.
Canada.
He's a sharp guy.
He was also on, it just came out on this week's Real News, a 2-part interview with Lapavitsas.
Oh, there was. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
very good, looking back on things.
Yeah,
He's-
yeah.
I think he's got a new book coming out, too.
Yeah, he's a smart guy.
Very smart,
Costa's
yeah.
a smart guy. Yeah. This is a bad deal. He just said it. This is a deal we're not going to sign. You know, it's a horrible deal. And he went through all the iterations. Everybody else is sitting there. You know, Walter Benjamin. What did Walter Benjamin have to do with, you know, this deal that's going down between, you know, Varoufakis and then bowed out, and then it was Tsipras, and that was a great conference. I had a great time. You know, it was a lot of fun.
Well, he's,
You know?
yeah, he's very critical of Varoufakis's attempt to reform the EU, which is his latest thing. If
You
know.
talk about social democrats.
Yeah. He takes him apart for that, you know, that the EU is a structure that you cannot reform. It is,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
no.
Exactly. Yeah. No, Varoufakis is a very bright man, but on the other hand, that's social democracy at work. This is not a militant like Lapavitsas and others at work. Yeah. No. Or Choukalas, for that matter, who's a wise old man. Very disappointed. Choukalas is a very interesting figure. He's going to come, by the way, to class. And next, the author of the book, The Age of Anxiety, he's coming in April
Great.
to New York, so we can have a nice, you know, conversation. But anyway, he's a tragic figure because he represents that generation. He was Mukas Poulantzas' great friend, you know, and best friend, and he was in Paris during this time. He taught. He came up through the ranks of the Greek left, etc., and he sees what's going down. I mean, he really is observing this in new generation, and worth learning from. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, Lefebvre is very good at political economy. Yeah, very good. He gave up his right, he gave up his seat in Parliament. They were voted out. That was the split from Syriza. They split from Syriza.
He went with the left platform or?
Yeah, the left
or
platform.
Popular
They
Committee,
lost.
is it, or-
They didn't even get 2% of the vote.
Yeah.
They had to get 2% of the vote in order to be in, yeah. But that was a moment. And I think, going back to Sartre, what it's really about, and I'm beginning to think this more and more, that people ultimately are really afraid of freedom. This is what the really great fear is the freedom to take power, the freedom to take over, the freedom to take risks, right? In a contest. This is really part of the problem right now. We're so ingrained into thinking about, what if I lose my job? What if this happens, et cetera, this kind of thinking, that this freedom and this, in a way, May 68, one person said it very aptly, was Sartre realized. It was spontaneity and freedom at the base, even though, it had a long history before it, but it manifested itself as this kind of Sartrean notion of that our existence is really predicated on freedom. And that we really are, or we are our projects. We're nothing more than our projects. This is his praxis. We are what we make, we are what we do. Which is a very Marxist thing without saying, without.
Heideggerian.
Yes, Heideggerian very much too. Our project, our thrownness,
Yeah,
our thrownness and what we make of that thrownness and what do we make. They have different notions of freedom, the Heideggerian and the Sartrean, but it's there, yeah. And Marx, of course, until we enter the realm of necessity, Marx is thinking in a much more objective, real way, in a sense, in terms of society at large. But in terms of lived experience, Sartre and Heidegger have it, down in a way, right?
Yeah, it was
Well,
interesting.
until we
interesting
enter the
film.
realm of necessity, we cannot really speak of freedom. Until we, overcome the realm of necessity. Yeah. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we saw that film
yes,
last night,
last night.
What is Democracy?
Did you answer the question?
It asked many questions, but it was co-sponsored, this particular show was co-sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung.
Kazemi was there.
Pardon me?
Kazemi.
Yeah,
Kazemi
Kazemi
was there, the moderator, yeah.
No, Kazemi was moderating.
Yeah.
Oh, he moderated.
Yeah, because this is, it's actually, they're co-sponsoring with the Goethe Institute this whole month. Rosa Luxemburg is.
Goethe and Luxembourg is a good combination. There's a
Yeah.
lot of power.
No, they're very much into it, and it's a great exhibit. This is at Irving Place, right near Union Square, the Goethe Institute building.
Yeah.
They're doing a really good, they had a great opening panel, and then they had the film last night.
And who made the film? I'm sorry.
It's a Canadian, Astra
Astra
Taylor,
Taylor.
and another woman.
Astra Taylor is made a film of Derrida and also on philosophy.
Yeah, well,
She's done this. Yeah, she's been
she's
around
good.
a while. She's a good friend of Zizek's
Yeah.
and company. She comes out of that kind of
Yeah.
Lacanian. Sorry.
Yeah.
Was she there or?
Yeah, she
Oh,
was
yeah,
there.
she was there,
and
and Sylvia Federici.
Oh, okay.
It's
All
she
right.
and Sylvia really who are kind of the protagonists in this thing.
Mainstay, yeah.
Or antagonists?
Yeah.
Did they
No,
get-
protagonists.
They were protagonists?
Yeah,
Okay.
it really is,
I'd be more interested if it was a cat
Yeah,
fight.
Oh.
No, be good, Michael. Yeah. We're already in enough trouble.
Yeah. The camera is
No,
on.
it was,
That's true.
no, it was a very good documentary, but much better than the.
But what is democracy? How did it
Well,
begin?
they just
Just a
asked
little
the
bit. I'm
question.
sorry
They
to
went around
diverse,
Freedom.
but- Freedom?
No, not necessarily, because it was really
Well, there was
different.
Y'all
there were
were
some-
right in March
there
here,
were
and
some
and George Gershwin too. It ain't
Yeah, there were some
necessarily
antagonists,
Some
like
said-
Brown from Berkeley was brought in
Wendy.
to argue against.
Was Wendy there?
No, she wasn't there, but
That's a
she's
good
in
book,
the,
by the way. Worth reading.
Yeah, she's in the documentary speaking about how there have to be limits.
Well, that's Kantian.
Oh,
Yeah.
Is this the Rousseauian woman from?
That's
Canada?
Kantian too.
Yeah, which one
I'm sorry.
the woman with the.
Yeah. She was, she was basically presenting Rousseau, but she surprised people, I think, at the end by saying, democracy can't include everybody. You have to have some people who are in and some out, even though the basis for exclusion shouldn't be the ones we use
Well, I mean,
now.
the notion of democracy in the Deems was framed during slave society.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
they pointed that out.
This is
Yeah.
very important to
Yeah.
remember.
Freedom.
This-
And that Marx and Nietzsche both are in agreement, you don't have civilization without slavery.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well-
this is, this has to be encountered, I mean,
Yeah.
in a certain way.
Yeah,
Where
they-
is this
they-
thinking predicated upon?
Right, they
Yeah.
grounded it beginning with Athens and the development of Western democracy anyway,
Right.
so.
Well, there's
yeah.
no Eastern democracy, is there? I mean, isn't it a Western import? I mean,
Well, they did make a passing reference to the contribution of the Native American.
Well, Celia Federici thought that
Yeah.
Native American systems
Yeah, she was,
were
that's
actually much closer to real democracy.
Yeah, they didn't mention it, but it.
Did they talk about Lewis Henry Morgan?
They didn't
No?
bring in Morgan, no.
Oh, I
not-
see,
Not
okay.
specifically, but,
Okay. Uh-huh.
it was very interesting, because they did a lot on Plato. They quoted Plato right from the beginning. They said, the passage, I went down to Piraeus, to see the ceremony, and of course.
Went down is the
Yeah, or
key
whatever.
phrase.
But anyway, of course, and then the documentary takes you to Piraeus, and, and
Right.
asks people stuff. But one of the things that was really interesting was the mural in Siena, which is just incredible was the really early Renaissance. And it was the beginning of the merchant class. That's where the first bank was in Siena, apparently.
Mhm.
But there's this incredible mural, and the Silvia Federici is, talking with Astor about, going through each wall and each part of it. And it's how it represented the different class structure, and the merchant class, and the philosopher kings at the top or something. And then you get to the other, this panel way off, and it shows people covered, their heads covered, tied up, one woman about to be beheaded. So there's like a reference that and the guilds were there too, struggling against the merchants in some way. That talking about when you were saying the ascending philosophy is a philosophy of the ascending class.
Yes.
This was clearly the ascending class. I
Right.
mean, the merchant class in Siena, and not without their antagonists.
Right.
But it's well. I thought it was well done. It really.
And the movie is like, I mean, it's both a travelogue and interviews with people. I mean, how is the film
well,
itself
It's
constructed?
it's interviews with people, but it's also they come back, they kind of jump
Yeah.
back and forth between the Siena mural and different interviews that they're doing.
Yeah.
There were some really good interviews that they did in Florida
Some terrific one. Yeah, really.
with students,
Students.
in a middle school.
Very sophisticated, young African American students.
What
that-
part of Florida was this?
I'm not sure.
Probably Miami, because
Yeah,
they
a
were.
lot
they
of it
were-
was in Miami.
Yeah.
And then there's also a great segment in a barber shop with a
Well, that's
barber.
where democracy is
Yeah,
really
that-
going.
yeah, of course. There's a barber who learned
Learned
his skill
barbering in prison.
in prison, and they show him.
Well, there's a
kind of-
place, an Astor
Yeah.
place. Those are all guys from prison. Where you can get your hair cut and get,
okay.
it's all prison,
yeah.
people, yeah.
It
Yeah, I
would've
used to
been
go there.
interesting.
They don't know what they're doing, but it's okay. They just get the buzz, they're ready, they're ready.
This barber was, shaving somebody and talking about, prison
Well, of
revolt
course, yeah,
and everything.
yeah.
And every now and then you would see the client.
Was there,
Who, and you see the anxiety, I thought, on his face as the razor gets close to his eye, and,
was there a reference to abolition democracy, to the Angela Davis and
She
the
was,
movement?
she was there. Cornel West was in the film. Angela Davis.
Yeah, but I mean, was there a reference to democracy as abolition of the prison system and the prison industrial complex? Was that a precondition for having democracy at this point? I mean, just wondering, because to me, that's a very important.
they
Kind of implied, but it wasn't really.
Yeah.
stated.
No, okay.
No, they
okay.
just they asked people, you know, in
I
different
see.
places in Greece.
So it's a
what-
kind of series of
what is
interviews that kind
democracy
of
to
try
you?
to
And
be
left it very
unified.
open, and
Okay.
it was
Yeah.
really interesting because,
Yeah. Serial thinking, and
yeah,
Sartre
because the
says, I'm sorry.
European-
Serial filmmaking.
yeah, the European folks said justice,
Right.
you know, but then when they came to the African Americans, they said freedom, you know, they said justice because freedom means you can do anything, so it doesn't mean anything. And the African American folks said, freedom is,
Freedom is
we
what
think.
counts.
Yeah, right. So, you know.
But the French Revolution itself, I mean, is predicated on liberty against the
Yeah.
old regime. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
it's the liberty to, you know.
Yeah, and they did stress the egalitarianism and
Right.
every human has equal worth.
Right.
And, you know,
Because Fanon begins The Wretched of the Earth about brotherhood, right? The French Revolution's values and how much that's been lost, right? He's very good at that. He keeps speaking of brother and European man speaks everywhere of freedom and of
Everywhere.
everywhere he goes, but he kills people in the name of, right? I mean, this is Fanon, and in terms of his early polemics and Wretched of the Earth, especially. Yeah. Yeah, interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's
other than
one thing
people,
I think,
just Angela Davis and Cornell, anybody else, like,
that they interviewed?
yeah, people of color, so to speak, yeah, yeah.
Well, they had, you know, a little bit on Barber, who was running for, the Reverend Barber was, you
Yeah.
know, a current, running for governor or something.
Oh, he's running for
He
governor?
was,
now?
or what was?
No, it was just,
He's
it was just, he was giving a speech in North Carolina.
North Carolina,
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought he he's, I know, started out as a community leader, but,
I don't think he's.
Okay.
running
no,
for-
maybe not, but they're.
So I guess it's gonna come around, so last night was the screening, an
No, so
opening screening with a,
That was a special screening,
Yeah.
and Kazembe gave out free tickets, so if you stay online in the.
didn't
cold-
call me, I wasn't in town.
Yeah, it was
but
great,
anyway.
but it's also showing just regularly too.
Okay,
on
good.
IFC,
Okay,
so.
yeah, it'll be interesting, yeah, it's a
On
good
IFC.
starting point
Yeah.
for students, I guess, yeah.
And the exhibit, the Rosa Luxemburg exhibit at the Goethe Institute is really, really very good too. They give equal weight to her vocation as a botanist, which goes back to her prison years, because the only thing she had to commune with plants growing through the concrete. So, you know, there's a book with, I think, those were her, oh, you didn't go to that?
I didn't go
Oh,
to
yeah,
that, no.
some really, really stunning drawings of plants and things that,
Oh, Luxembourg was good at,
she apparently so.
a draft person,
A
right?
draft,
Okay,
apparently she
interesting.
wrote this, and, because
I
she
wonder
did.
if Picasso knew about that,
I
yeah.
don't know. But, she had all these years on her hands and nothing much to do.
Yeah, right,
She got
Right.
into plants.
interesting,
Yeah.
okay, good. All right, well, let's go back to
Okay.
Sartre. So anyway, on page 14, he makes of it the immediate theme, middle of the page, of the philosophical totalization is the concrete man who he puts at the center of his research, that man who is simultaneously defined simultaneously by his needs, by the material conditions of existence, the nature of his work, that is, by the struggle against things and against men. Thus Marx, rather than Kierkegaard as Hegel, is right, since he asserts with Kierkegaard the specificity of human existence. So you see how Sartre's working here, obviously, trying to incorporate, Kierkegaard alongside Marx, right? And along with Hegel, takes the concrete man as an objective reality. Under these circumstances, it would seem natural if existentialism, this idealist protest against idealism, had lost all usefulness had it not survived the decline of Hegelianism. But in fact, existentialism suffered an eclipse. In this general struggle, which bourgeois thought leads against Marxist dialectic, it gets its support from the post-Kantians, from Kant himself, from Descartes. It never thinks of addressing itself to Kierkegaard. The Dane will reappear at the beginning of the 20th century when people will take it in their heads to fight against Marxism by opposing it to its pluralisms, ambiguities, paradox. That is, in its revival dates back to the moment from the first time bourgeois thought was reduced to being on the defensive, right? Between the two world wars, the appearance of a German existentialism certainly corresponds, at least in the work of Jaspers, to a surreptitious wish to resuscitate the transcendence. Already, as Wallace pointed out, one could wonder if Kierkegaard did not lure his readers into the depths of subjectivity for the sole purpose of making them there discover the unhappiness of man without God. You know the Randy Newman song? You know
That's
Randy
why I
Newman?
love.
Yeah, that's why I love mankind. He really needs me. Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, this is what's going on. It's a great song. Yeah. I burn down your cities. You say, how blessed are we? How we laugh in heaven, and how stupid you all must be. That's why I love mankind. He really needs me. It's a great song.
It is a great
it's
song.
done like a fugue. It's
Yeah.
God's fugue, so to speak. Right? Yeah. Anyway, I'm just
I know the
Free
other one,
association.
everyone hates
Yeah.
us, let's drop the big one and end it all.
That's political science.
Yeah.
That's
He calls it political science 101. No one likes us. I don't know why. Heaven knows we really try. We
Right.
give them money. Are they grateful? No, they're spiteful and they're hateful.
Sounds like Trump.
Yeah. Let's drop the big. Well, he's part of that generation.
Yeah.
That's Trump's emergence. The Art of the Deal came after Randy Newman put that album out in 1976 or 77. That was after Short People upset everybody in
Yeah.
Baltimore.
Mm.
The Little Criminals album. That was the one after the Little Criminals album. The short people got no reason to live, right? Right. Anyway, yeah. And the things on racism, very funny. I mean, he's a great ironist, Randy Newman. I think, yeah. Anyway, all right. So this trap would be quite in keeping with the great solitary who denied communication between human beings and who saw no way to influence his fellow man except by direct actions. Jaspers put his cards in there. Everybody knows Karl Jaspers. He was a colleague and friend of Heidegger's, and then they had a break. But Jaspers continued. If you want to understand American bureaucracy in a deeper way, read the Jaspers Hannah Arendt correspondence of the 1950s. Pretty amazing stuff on the bureaucratization in everyday life in America. It's a great correspondence, by the way. They remain very close friends. And, Jaspers was a psychiatrist, not a psychoanalyst, but he practiced psychiatry alongside writing a history of philosophy and a book called Reason and Existence, The Question of German Guilt, that's very good, which ends actually a piece in Situations on Ian Curtis's relationship to the Vodka-Meinhof group. Anyway, all to say, Jaspers is worth reading, and I think his great piece is a psychiatric study of Van Gogh and Strindberg and schizophrenia. It's a wonderful phenomenological approach to schizophrenia. Yeah. Anyway, he wrote a general psychopathology, 3 volumes as well. Anyway, so the transcendent, we ought to catch a presentment of the transcendent in our failures. It's their profound meaning. This idea is already found in Kierkegaard, but it's less emphasized since this Christian thinks and lives within the compass of a revealed religion, and that's Hegelian terms. Revealed religion is a whole section of the phenomenology. Yeah, Phil? You had a question?
No.
Oh, okay. And Jaspers, mute on revelation, leads us back through discontinuity, pluralism, and impotence to the pure formal subjectivity which is discovered and which allows transcendence through its defeats. Success, indeed, as an objectification, would enable the person to inscribe himself in things and finally would compel him to surpass himself. The meditation on failure is perfectly suited to a bourgeoisie. This is very interesting. And I suggest, if you're interested in this stuff, to read Adorno's Kierkegaard construction of an aesthetic, because I think they're very similar in some ways in their approach to Kierkegaard during this point. This would make a wonderful, I know you're not going to philosophy graduate school, but anyway, a wonderful dissertation on the relationship of Adorno and Lukács and Sartre to Kierkegaard, in the light of their Marxism, something like that. Maybe I should write the essay. Get it over with. Anyway. Okay, so they lost
In your spare
confidence in
time.
their, my spare time, all the time I have, right? In the rationalist positivist ideology, Kierkegaard already considered that every victory is suspect because it turns man away from himself. Hence his remark, in the present age, we live in the age of advertising and publicity, nothing really happens, right, yeah, etc. Kafka took this Christian theme again in his own journal. And one could find a certain truth in the idea, since in a world of alienation, the individual conqueror does not recognize himself in his victory and becomes its slave. But what is important to Jaspers is to derive from all this a subjective pessimism, which ultimately emerges as a theological optimism that does not dare to speak its name. The transcendent indeed remains veiled. It is attested only by its absence. One will never be gone beyond pessimism. One will have a presentiment of reconciliation remaining at the level of an insurmountable contradiction and total cleavage. This condemnation of dialectic is aimed no longer at Hegel but at Marx. It is no longer the refusal of knowledge but the refusal of praxis. This is interesting, right? Kierkegaard was unwilling to play the role of a concept in the Hegelian system. Jaspers refuses to cooperate as an individual with the history which Marxism are making. Kierkegaard realized some progress over Hegel by affirming the reality of the lived. Jaspers regresses in the historical moment, right? For he flees from the real movement of praxis and takes refuge in his abstract subjectivity, whose sole aim is to achieve a certain inward quality. This ideology of withdrawal expressed quite well only yesterday the attitude of a certain Germany, fixed on its two defeats, and that of a certain European bourgeoisie which wants to justify its privileges by an aristocracy of the soul, to find refuge from its objectivity in an exquisite subjectivity, and let it be fascinated by its ineffable present, so as not to see its future. Philosophically, this soft, devious thought is only a survival. It holds no great interest. But it is one more existentialism was developed at the margin of Marxism and not against it. It is Marx with whom we will claim kinship, and Marx whom I wish to speak now. So you can see these first 5 pages are setting the framework for Sartre's atheistic existentialism against Jasper's transcendent existentialism, right? That he's trying to begin the dialogue with. And I think it's very interesting the way he goes about this, because it gives us a sense of all the, critiques, polemics, and antagonisms that are going on in the 1950s and maybe through the 60s, and today in other forms. I mean, look, Christian liberation theology is very much right out of this, in some ways, when you begin to think of liberation theology in Latin America, right? Yeah, when you think of King and the Christian, the movements, right, etc. Right? These are very, very important things especially to the black church and the black, Afro-American culture in the United States, and again, the Latin American context. So I think this is very relevant, very, very relevant to this. And again, he's really problematizing method here, how difficult it is to come up with a Marxist method that will include subjectivity. This is very dense, in many ways. And a first-rate mind at work who understands understands the contradictions and the paradoxes that would emerge. I don't know how you feel, about reading this, but I think it's, a beautifully constructed, text in this regard, And it's both pro-Hegelian Marxism and also anti-Hegelianism, and he's really right where Kierkegaard says, I don't want to be a concept. I want lived experience. And this is what Hegelianism turned into. This is the way the proletariat became for automatic Marxism, a concept, not a lived subjective being. And one of the great, some of you know Patricio Guzman's film, The Battle of Chile. If you remember, the avant-garde meeting with the workers, and the vanguard supposedly knows best, whereas the workers knew exactly what was going down, and they did not respect the lived experience of the workers during that period. Or there may have been a different kind of insurrection that took place instead of just Pinochet taking over, with the direction of the CIA.
Yeah, Allende.
And something that Chavez understood, you know, in Venezuela earlier, later on.
Well, the Venezuelans are very clear, they learned from the Allende experience.
Yes, they did, yes,
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah, he armed his workers.
Smart to do, that's right, that's right, yeah, yeah. All right, so I'm just thinking, I read a very good book on Abel Ferrara. I want to do a course on the filmmaker Abel Ferrara. I was thinking of Miss 45. I watched that film when I was in Montreal. I streamed it. He's so good. I mean,
The Addiction
The Addiction's a great film.
Mm-hmm.
She bites her committee.
Yeah.
with Walken,
That's right.
Christopher
Nietzsche,
Walken.
Nietzsche
or-
wasn't evil enough.
No.
Remember that great scene? He
Yeah.
says,
Said, yeah.
Nietzsche wasn't evil enough. You think Nietzsche was evil?
Christian movie.
Yeah.
It's in
The
Christian
Addiction?
time.
Yeah. What's her name, the actress? I mean, Lily
Lily,
Taylor.
oh,
Taylor.
no,
Lily Taylor.
Yeah, Taylor. right?
Taylor.
Yeah, Lily Taylor. Great film, by the way.
Yeah.
It begins with you know, at CUNY, they use a classroom at CUNY on Heidegger. It's interesting, yeah. The professor, yeah, she's a philosophy graduate student. And there's an amazing sequence when she meets this anthropology major, speaking of philosophical anthropology. It's hilarious scene at the New York Public Library. She seduces her, they go home, of course she bites her. The girl gets up in the morning, "What have you done to me?" She's looking in the mirror and all of this. And she says, and Lily Taylor says, "It's astonishing that you're not in complete wonderment. Instead, you sit there like a hysteric, wondering what happened to you. You don't, that you're not amazed about the beauty of all this." So philosophy meets anthropology. Anthropology is suffering, whereas philosophy goes back to the wonderment. It's a great film, by the way. I mean, everything he did is good. You know, I think. You know, about 2006, 2007. 4 minutes, 33 seconds. Did you see that? That's
Yeah.
filmed on Delancey Street.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
Defoe, oh, you didn't like that one? Yeah, okay. I went
I
on
don't know.
Christmas Day with Stanley to that many years when it first came out. Yeah. Yeah, they didn't like that one, yeah.
I can rewatch it.
Yeah, okay. Miss 45, Go-Go Years. Did you see that one? On the Go-Go clubs, yeah, it's very funny.
We did one on Pasolini.
He did one on Pasolini,
really?
that's right, that's right. No, he made major filmmaker, yeah, I mean, completely under-theorized. The best critic on him is a woman named Nicole Brenez. She's a French critic. Brilliant book on Abel Ferrara. Evil Without Flowers, the play on Flowers of Evil of Baudelaire.
Mhm.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful book. Very, very solid, yeah. Anyway, I think he's the great symptomatologist of New York, especially New York
Mhm.
life. King of New York, by the way, the model is Donald Trump.
Indeed.
Because he's coming up, you know, as the king of real estate during that period, right?
Yeah,
In some
yeah.
ways, yeah. And it's a similar kind of character in a way. Yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. He's a good guy. Bang, you know. Remember Walken, you know, yeah, goes in. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. We're gonna help him out. We're gonna do this, right? Anyway, all right. Let's go on a little. The ideology of withdrawal is a great phrase, I think, too. You know, that he uses that could be worked out too. You know, as a phrase to talk about today. What does that mean? The ideology of withdrawal. You know, and you know, how does it work in life? So anyway, knowledge stimulates ideas. Absolutely right. In 1925. When I was 20 years old, Sartre talks about himself, there was no chair of Marxism at the university. And communist students were careful not to appeal to Marxism or even to mention it in their examinations because they would fail, right? Had they done so, they would have failed. The horror of the dialectic was such that Hegel himself was unknown to us. Of course, they allowed us to read Marx, and this is American philosophy departments, you know, to the letter. The worst. The worst. I mean, I'm telling you, yeah. To read Marx, they then even advised us to read him. One had to know him in order to refute him. But without the Hegelian tradition, without Marxist teachers, without any planned program of study, without the instruments of thought, our generation, like the preceding ones, and that which followed, were wholly ignorant of historical materialism. Completely in the dark, right? On the other hand, they taught us Aristotelianism, mathematical logic in great detail. It was about this time I read Capital and German Ideology. I found everything perfectly clear. And I really understood absolutely nothing. To understand is to change. I like that phrase. Understand is to change. To go beyond oneself. Very beautiful on Verstanden, right? Yeah, yeah. This reading did not change me. By contrast, what did change me was the reality of Marxism. Interesting, right? Sartre at his best, right? I got knocked out, right, from outside, right? Right? The heavy presence on my horizon of the mass of workers, an enormous somber body which lived Marxism, which practiced it, and which at a distance exercised an irresistible attraction on petite, and he called them, I am, have you ever heard Sartre speak? It's like listening to, I am a petit bourgeois intellectual, you know. I have lived in bad faith most of my life. When I came to Marxism, I try to give it up. This is what we must do. You know, it's very, very good, the voice. When we read this philosophy in books, it enjoyed no privilege in our eyes. A priest who had just written a voluminous and very interesting work on Marx calmly states in the opening pages, it is possible to study his thought just as securely one studies any other philosophy or any other sociologist. This is exactly what we believed. So long as his thought appeared to us through written words, we remained objective. Quote unquote. We said to ourselves, here are the conceptions of a German intellectual who lived in London in the middle of the 18th century. But when it was presented as a real determination of the proletariat, capitalized here, knowledge, right, history, and proletariat capitalized, and it's the profound meaning of its acts for itself and in itself, then Marxism attracted us irresistibly without our knowing it, and it put all our acquired culture out of shape. I repeat, it was not the idea what unsettled it, nor was the condition of the worker, which we abstractly, but which we would not experience. No, it was the two joined together. It was, as we would have said then in our idealist jargon, even as we were breaking with idealism, the proletarian is the incarnation and vehicle of an idea. And I believe we here must complete Marx's statement, when the rising class becomes conscious of the self, this self-consciousness acts as a distance upon intellectuals and makes the ideas in their heads disintegrate. We rejected the official idealism in the name of the tragic sense of life, which is, by the way, the footnote shows you, Unamuno, a very beautifully constructed, passionate book on, you know, the tragic sense of life as they're dying, really, ultimately. Beautifully written, Unamuno. He's also a storyteller and novellist, you know, and also a Basque intellectual, yeah, yeah. This proletariat, far off, invisible, inaccessible, but conscious and acting, furnished the proof, obscurely, for most of us, that not all conflicts had been resolved. We had brought up in bourgeois humanism, right? And this optimistic humanism was shattered when we vaguely perceived around our town the immense crowd of sub-men conscious of their subhumanity. And this is taken up by Fanon, the subhuman, that he begins to take up in The Wretched of the Earth, you know, this phrase, right? But we sensed this shattering in a way that was still idealist and individualistic. So it's very interesting how he sets this up by Kierkegaard. I mean, I find this magnificent writing, you know, I mean, in a way that, you know, this is, goes to show you the quality of this mind and this essayist at work, you know, this is worthy of study, how one would set up how existentialism should be part of the Marx, but not, you know, and, you know, integrated into the system, but not separate or, you know, as a reaction to it, right? Okay, so and sometimes these writers who we loved explained to us that existence is a scandal. What interests us, however, was real men with their labors and their troubles. We cried out for a philosophy which would account for everything, and we did not perceive that it existed already. It was held from us completely. And it was precisely this philosophy which provoked in us this demand. At that time, one book enjoyed a great success around us, Jean Val's Towards the Concrete. So you have the unhappy consciousness that he wrote, Hegel and the state, and Towards the Concrete. Those were John Wall's three major contributions. Nobody's that I know of in the United States or in the English language has written on John Wall. But a significant figure during this time. Yet we were disappointed by the toward. Right? No longer, we want the concrete. Right? The total concrete was what we wanted to leave behind us. The absolute concrete is what we wanted to achieve. Still, the work pleased us in an embarrassed idealism by discovering in the ultimate universe paradoxes, ambiguities, conflicts still unresolved. We learned to turn pluralism, that concept of the right. It's interesting when people talk of pluralism, and Zizek is very good on this, on multiculturalism. He was one of the best on that going out, this kind of pluralistic argumentation and what multiculturalism led to, as basically an ideology of the right, even though they use it, right, to criticize, Yeah, this is interesting. Against the optimistic, monistic idealism of our professors in the name of a leftist thought, which is still ignorant of itself. And I like Stanley's phrase, and in this context, to me, it's very relevant. There's no left, there are many leftists. I like that very much. I think that's worthy of thinking about where we are. There are leftists, but there's no left. I think this is a very, 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 very well thought out there in some ways, Stanley being Stanley, sometimes, right, like that. Okay, enthusiastically, we adopted all those doctrines which divided men into watertight groups, petite bourgeois Democrats who rejected racism, but we'd like to think that primitive mentality, the universe of the child, and the madman remained entirely impenetrable to us. Under the influence of war and the revolution, we offered violence, only theoretically, of course, in opposition to the sweet dreams of our professors. It was a wretched violence. You can see why they hated him. This academic community. Insults, brawls, suicides, murders, irreparable catastrophe, which risked leading us to fascism, but in our eyes, it had the advantage of highlighting the contradictions of reality. Thus, Marxism as a philosophy which had become the world, by the way, a title of a commentary, a very good book, by Ronald Aronson, Philosophy in the World. He's a very good commentator. You know Ronald Aronson?
Yeah.
Detroit, and professor at Wayne State. Very, very good book. He became good friends with Sartre's adopted daughter, Arlette and they were in contact. Wrenched us away from the defunct culture of a bourgeoisie which was barely subsisting on its past. We plunged blindly down the dangerous path of a pluralist realism concerned with man and man, things in concrete existence, yet we remained within the compass of dominating ideas. Although we wanted to know man in his real life, we did not yet have the idea of considering him first a worker who creates the conditions of his life, the labor question, right here. For a long time, we confused the total and the individual. Pluralism, which has served us well against Brunswick's idealism, and Leon Brunswick was the head doyen of French intellectual life at this time. Cartesian, he was known for this. Leon Brunswick, of whom, Nizan saves the most virulent polemic against him, the watchdogs, is Leon Brunswick and that school of philosophy, right? All right, prevented us from understanding the dialectical totalization. It pleased us to decry essences and artificially isolated types rather than to reconstitute the synthetic movement of a truth that had become. Political events led us to employ the schema of the class struggle as a sort of grid, more convenient than veridical. But it took the whole bloody history of this half-century to make us grasp the reality of the class struggle and to situate us in a split society. It was the war which shattered the worn structures of our thought, the war, Vichy, occupation, Vichy, resistance against Vichy, right? The years which followed. We wanted to fight at the side of the working class. We finally understood that the concrete is history and dialectical action. We had repudiated pluralistic realism, only to find it again among the fascists, and we discovered the world. Why then has existentialism preserved its autonomy? Why did it not become simply dissolved in Marxism? And remember, this is the father speaking to the new philosophy, of which is shattering his petite intellectual, intellectual background, his petite bourgeois ideas. It's amazing. The honesty is I like, it's very, very rigorous and quite striking. Lukács, so it goes back to Lukács, believed he had answered this question in a little pamphlet called Existentialism and Marxism. According to him, bourgeois intellectuals have been forced to abandon the method of idealism while safeguarding its results and its foundations. Hence, the historical necessity of the third path, that is between materialism and idealism. In actuality, and in the bourgeois consciousness during the imperialist time, I will show, however, later, the havoc that this wish to conceptualize a priori has wrought at the center of Marxism. Here let us simply observe that Lukács fails absolutely to account for the principal fact. We were convinced at one and the same time, that historical materialism furnished the only valid interpretation of history, and that existentialism remained the only concrete approach to reality. I do not pretend to deny the contradictions in the attitude. I simply assert that Lukács does not even suspect it. Many intellectual students have lived and still live with the tension of this double demand. And that's interesting. How does this come about? It is due to circumstances which Lukács knew perfectly well, but which he could not at that time even mention. Marxism, after drawing us to it as the moon draws the tides, after transforming all our ideas, after liquidating the categories of our bourgeois thought, abruptly left us stranded. A new shipwreck, right? It did not satisfy our need to understand. In the particular situation in which we were placed, it no longer had anything new to teach it because it had come to a stop. Interesting, right? Marxism stopped, precisely because this philosophy wants to change the world, because its aim, and this is a nice aim, and I like this is what Ronald Aronson took up as his title, philosophy becoming the world. Right? As Labriola once said in the Italian field in the 19th century and the early 20th century, we will come a day when we live philosophically as Spinoza did everyday life. That is the quote, blessed life, but I like to turn that into prosperity, Marxism at this point, or an Epicurean form, right? Because it is and wants to be practical. There arose within a veritable schism which rejected theory on one side and practice on the other. From the moment the USSR, and remember the context, this is 1952. This is the beginning of the de-Stalinization period, almost the beginning of the 20th Congress, right? From the moment the USSR encircled and alone undertook its gigantic effort in industrialization, Marxism found itself unable to bear the shock of these new struggles, the practical necessities and the mistakes which were always inseparable from them. At this period of withdrawal for the USSR and ebb tide for the revolutionary proletariats, the ideology itself was subordinated to a double need. And this is interesting too. Security, that is unity, and the construction of socialism in one country, or inside the USSR. Concrete thought must be born from praxis and must turn back upon it in order to clarify it, not by chance and without rules, but as in all sciences and technique, in conformity with principles. Now the party leaders, bent on pushing the integration of the group to the limit, feared that the free processes of truth, with all the discussions and conflicts which it involved, would break the unity of combat. Interesting, right? Yeah. They reserved for themselves the right to define the line and interpret the event. In addition, out of fear that the experience might not provide its own clarities, that it might put into question certain of their guiding ideas and might contribute to a weakening of the ideological struggle, they put the doctrine out of reach. The separation of theory and practice, resulting in transforming the latter into empiricism without principles, the former into pure fixed knowledge. On the one hand, the economic planning imposed by bureaucracy, unwilling to recognize its mistakes, became therefore a violence done to reality. And since the future production of a nation was determined in offices outside its own territory, this violence had its counterpart, an absolute idealism. Very interesting the way he sees this, the Soviet bureaucracy, bureaucratic socialism, bureaucratic communism at work, of which Marcuse takes up too in the book called Soviet Marxism, points out very similar characteristics. Men and things had to yield to ideas a priori. Experience, when it did not verify the predictions, could only be wrong. Right? That didn't happen. No. You know the gig. Budapest subway was real in Roskovsky's mind. Head. If Budapest subsoil did not allow them to construct the subway, this was because the subsoil was counter-revolutionary. It's funny, huh? Yeah. Marxism is a philosophical interpretation of man and of history, necessarily had to reflect on the preconceptions of this planned economy, the planned economy. The fixed image of idealism and violence did idealistic violence to facts, right? So it goes on here about Trotsky sympathizers. They've been created by their sympathy for the Communist Party or by the opposition to it. On November 4th, 1956, at the time of the second Soviet intervention in Hungary, each group already had its mind made up before it possessed any information on the situation, argue with them or against. And you saw this play out in the, what's the name of the filmmaker? Vajdas, right? Men of Steel and Men of Irons with Lech Walesa Vajda, right? Very interesting. It decided in advance whether it was witnessing an act of aggression, the democracy of workers' committees, with a revolt of the masses against the bureaucratic system, or with a counter-revolutionary attempt with Soviet moderation had known how to check. Later there was news, a great deal of news, but I have not heard it yet that not even one Marxist has changed his opinion, right, in a way. So now you begin to get this in terms of, the phenomenological approach, unless you strip this down to, the preconceptual, and to look at that, you're not going to really see the reality of the situation. So he's using his expertise. I mean, this is a first-rate phenomenological mind, at work. All right. So among the interpretation, what I just mentioned, the one that shows the method in all its nakedness, that which reduces the facts in Hungary to a Soviet act of aggression against the democracy of the working committees. It is obvious the working committees are a democratic institution. One can maintain that they bear within themselves the future of a socialist society. But this does not alter the fact that they did not exist in Hungary at the time of the first Soviet intervention, and their appearance during the insurrection was much too brief and too troubled for us to be speaking of an organized democracy. I'm sure Astor Taylor didn't go here. I'm sorry. No matter. There was work. I have a prejudice towards, these kind of figures like Sartre. Anyway, there was workers' committees. The Soviet intervention took place. Starting from their Marxist idealism proceeds to two simultaneous operations: conceptualization and passage to the limit. So he's really inside the head. I mean, this is really, again, this real understanding of this. And what can we learn from this? We can see the automatic, almost psychic automatic tendencies of economic deterministic Marxism, the ideology of, why is it always the economy stupid, right, etc. The lack of really thinking through alternative cultures, even though we know it's wrong, right? The ideology of 1% against the 99, the rest of us, etc. And how, in some ways, reductionistic this really is in terms of thinking and in terms of our own praxis, right? So they push the empirical notion to the perfection of the type. So you already have this kind of essentialistic, thinking, operating, the types, etc. And then the germ to its total development. At the same time, they reject the equivocal givens of experience that can only lead one astray. So again, this is a privileging of why existentialism, even though it's a parasitic system, it is needed in Marxism because of this notion of the lived experience and getting to that. Yeah? We find ourselves then in the presence of a typical contradiction between two Platonic ideas. And it's interesting here, it goes back to this. The wavering policy of the USSR gave way to the rigorous and predictable action of that entity, the Soviet bureaucracy. On the other side, the workers' committee disappeared before that other entity, the direct democracy. Interesting, huh? I shall call these two objects general particularities that are made to pass for particular historical realities, that when we ought not to see them in anything more than the pure formal unity of abstract, not concrete, but abstract universal relation. The processes of making them into fetishes will be complete when each one is endowed with real powers. The democracy of workers' committees holds within itself the absolute negation of the bureaucracy, which reacts by crushing its adversary. And he actually shows these processes at work, what really is going on. It's interesting, right? How good he is. This is 56, right? He's looking at the Hungarian. And there can be no doubt that the fruitfulness of living Marxism stemmed in part from its way of approaching experience. Marx was convinced that facts are never isolated appearances. Even if they come into being together, it is always within the higher unity of the whole that they are bound to each other by internal relations. Very important to remember. A lot of Marxists forget this, right? And that the presence of one profoundly modifies the nature of the other. Consequently, Marx approached the study of the revolution of February 1848, or Bonaparte's coup d'etat, with a synthetic intent. He saw in these events totalities produced, this is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, produced and at the same time split apart by the internal contradictions. Of course, the physicist's hypothesis, before it's been confirmed by experimentation, is also an interpretation of experience. It rejects empiricism simply because it is mute, but the constitutive schema of this hypothesis is universalizing, not totalizing. It determines a relation, a function, and not a concrete totality. The Marxist approaches the historical process with universalizing and totalizing schemata. Naturally, the totalization was not made by chance. The theory has determined the choice of perspective and the order of the conditioning factors. It studied each particular process within the framework of a general system in evolution. But in no case in Marx's own work does this putting into perspective claim to prevent us to render useless the appreciation of the process as a unique totality. When, for example, he studies the brief, tragic history of the Republic of 1848, he does not limit himself, as it would be done today, Marx, to stating that the Republican petite bourgeoisie portrayed its ally, the proletariat. On the contrary, he tries to account for this tragedy in its detail and its aggregate. If he subordinates analytic facts to the totality of a movement or of an attitude, he also seeks to discover the totality by means of the facts. And you can think about, why does Trump have the working class as part of his base in some places, right? How did this come about? What was failed? Who failed the working class? The Democratic Party, obviously, right? Yeah, there's been no the unions. Look at the levels of the failures. Unless you deal with this archaeology of the failures, you're not going to see it for what it is. You can't just say it's because they're macho and they like the talk of the Trump or something like that, or it's just another version of male fantasies. It has a very long history in terms of processes, how this is formed. It's very, very important to keep this in mind. How he's really trying to look at this in terms of, you cannot just universalize this as a type or a class. You have to understand the process that historically made it into what it is. And he says that Marxism doesn't do this. Yeah. So this is, this kind of Marxism,
Dogmatic,
the
yeah.
automatic Marxism, right? Marx does, of course. It gives to each event, teach its particular signification, the role of being revealing. So you go back to the air controller strike. You go back to union struggles since then. Reagan's defeat of unions, right? Contract negotiations, etc. What's been delivered? What did the Democratic Party do? What did the Clinton regime do? That you got Hillary Clinton on the scene? How moronic the Democratic Party could be in terms of choosing a candidate that has no currency at all with the working class in the United States, when you really think about this. And that Bernie Sanders would have had at least a fighting chance, right? Yeah.
No, she
Yeah,
was
yeah.
Deplorable.
derisive of the
Yeah.
working class.
You mean the deplorables?
Deplorable, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, she was deplorable.
Yeah, right, indeed, right. We should,
Yeah, no.
change the name of the town they live in from, what's the name of that place in Westchester County?
Katana.
Yeah.
No, not
Katana.
Not
No,
Katona,
it's, Chautauqua.
Chautauqua, right, right. Change it to the deplorables.
Well, actually,
Chautauqua.
Chautauqua.
Chautauqua is up
Right,
in
right,
upstate
right,
New York.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Chautauqua.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this is interesting, this becomes his vocabulary, it's abstract to us without definitive, but he starts to use, since the ruling principle of the inquiry is the search for the synthetic ensemble, right? Yeah, of relations. Each fact, that's internal relations going through, once established is questioned and interpreted as part of a whole, the synthetic ensemble, right? It is on the basis of the fact, through the study of its lacks and its oversignification, that one determines by virtue of a hypothesis the totality at the heart of which the fact will recover its truth. Thus, living Marxism, not dead, right? Living, is heuristic. Its principles and its prior knowledge appear as regulative in relation to its concrete research. In the work of Marx, which we never find entities, totalities, for example, the petit bourgeois of the 18th through or living, they furnish their own definitions within the framework. Interesting, you're not going with a preconceived conceptual framework. This is very important to remember that he's really trying to do here, right? And this is what existentialism does with experience, what Marxism should do when the investigation is underway. Within the framework of the research, right? They furnish their own definitions of the research. Otherwise, we could not understand the importance which Marxists attach, even to today, to the analysis of a situation. And analysis, literally, in the Greek sense, means to undo, right? To really undo. It goes without saying that this analysis is not enough, and that it is but the first moment in the effort towards synthetic reconstruction. And this is Cartesianism in the French language at work. The analytic is working first before the synthetic. Very interesting the way this French, Cartesianism puts itself into the Marxist tradition from Sartre. But it's apparent that also the analysis is indispensable to the latter reconstruction of the total structure. Marxist volunteerism, which we like to speak of analysis, has reduced this operation to a simple ceremony. There's no longer a question of studying facts within the general perspective of Marxism so as to enrich our understanding and to clarify action. Analysis consists simply getting rid of detail, forcing the signification of certain events, denaturing facts, or even inventing the nature for them in order to discover it later underneath them as their substance, as unchangeable, fetishized synthetic notion. You know how many people we know like this, who operate this way? Every day we see it, right? The open concepts of Marxists had closed in. They're no longer keys, interpret a schemata, they're positive for themselves as an already totalized narrative. And you look at identity politics, you look at certain isms that are used today, etc. He's really speaking to this as well, right? Very much so. To use Kantian terms, Marxism makes out of these particularized, fetishized types constitutive concepts of experience. The real content of the typical concepts is already past knowledge, but today's Marxist makes of it as an eternal knowledge. His sole concern at the moment of analysis would be to place these entities. The more he is convinced that they represent truth a priori, the less fussy he will be about proof, as long as it fits in my construct. And what phenomenology, at least to me, is great about? It takes away from constructive thinking, right? You're basically taking away the constructs, right? In order to get to the filled experience. And this is a very important thing. And in a way, it's been their critique of psychoanalytic. The psychoanalytic approach sometimes has the constructed knowledge. We know what the neurosis is. We know what the family romance is. We know the narrative, this kind of thing. But it takes away somewhat from it. So it's a construct thinking instead of a phenomenological. This is a very interesting distinction that should be made, I think, for us to go forward. The Kernstein Amendment, the appeals for Radio Free Europe, rumors these are all sufficient for the French communists to place the entity world imperialism at the origin of the events in Hungary. And you see how he comes back around. This is a really good-minded work. He takes something happening in the moment, analyzes it, gives it philosophical categorization, right, tries to work with it, and then get to the phenomena itself, and comes back around. This totalizing investigation has given way to a scholasticism of the totality. The heuristic principle to search for the whole in its parts has become the terrorist practice of liquidating the particularity. This is interesting. What the terrorist does is liquidates the particularity of a group. It's interesting. And I suggest, since Lefebvre, I don't know if we're going to have a whole lot of time, but I can do it if you want. But anyway, the liquidating the particularity, right? One of Lefebvre's great essays, Everyday Life in the Everyday Life in the Modern World, 1968, is Everyday Life in Terrorism, Terrorism in Everyday Life. It's a wonderful attempt to look at terrorism and how it afflicts us daily, you know. And it's the notion of this Hegelian state terror at work, right? But he's very good at this, you know. Very, very worth reading. It is not by chance that Lukács, and again, comes back around, who so often violates history, has found, and you know, he doesn't really forgive Lukács for, you know, becoming the social realist of his moment. The best definition of this frozen Marxism, right? Very interesting. 20 years of practice give him all the authority necessary to call this pseudo-philosophy a voluntaristic idealism. Okay? So anyway, he's going to go through this, you know, again, you know, how we need to get back to experience, right? So any thoughts from you, from you here? I mean, you know, he's taking on the French communist tradition, etc. Let me just jump ahead for a second here. Let us go further. I mean, look at page 30, for example. Existentialism, like Marxism, right, addresses itself to experience in order to discover these concrete syntheses. It can conceive of these syntheses only within a moving dialectical totalization when there's nothing else but history, or from the strictly cultural point of view, which we have adopted here, philosophy becoming the world. For us, truth is something which becomes. It has and will have become. It is a totalization which is forever being totalized. Particular facts do not signify anything. They are neither true nor false so long as they are not related through the mediation of various partial totalities to the totalization in process. There's no such thing as an eternal fixed truth, right? In this sense, right? One of the reasons that Badiou, who the more I read of, at least philosophically speaking, is very close to Sartre when he does truth procedures in this matter. You know, if you go back to one of our, you know, high-ranking philosophers of today, Alain Badiou, you begin to see, you know, in him the, you know, this notion of the truth procedure takes a lot from this. It's very Sartrean, Badiou, you know. Badiou is the product of Lacan, Sartre, right, and Marx. You know, it's very interesting in that regard, you know. And of course, the mathematics is a different story, but, you know, in terms of his conceptual work and his invention of concepts, etc. Okay, it's getting late for some people.
I'm
You
going
have
to take off in a
appointments.
minute, Michael. But what do you make of him on Lukács? Sartre?
What do I make of Sartre and Lukács?
Yeah.
I think he's very right on about Lukács has denied the, you know, the lived experience, and has kind of gone the way of, you know, a kind of fetishization of socialism in one country at all costs. I think he sees him in this regard, and he also later speaks about Lukács, you know, has the capacity to read Heidegger, but doesn't do so because he, you know,
Says that.
he says this later in the essay. So yes, in some ways, I think it's very important to understand that. I don't think he's arguing against the Lukács of the history and class consciousness in terms of building something. I think he's arguing more against the Lukács who goes to criticize existentialism on the grounds of a kind of dead Marxism, if you will, or an objectivating Marxism that's not in process anymore. So that's what he's sort of losing with Lukács, that he's lost process and dialectical becoming, that Lukács becomes fixed in certain categories of his thinking. You know, so you have to remember Lukács in the 1930s will deny Kafka, Joyce, all of modern literature, much experimentation, etc., which has at its root subjective, refusal of bourgeois culture. It's not that these were reactionary forms in a certain way. I mean, you can read Ulysses as the end of liberal capitalism. If you want to go back and read Ulysses and you look at Leopold Bloom in One Day in the Life, 24 Hours, and A Modern Odyssey, you begin to see there that really what's at stake is Joyce is seen, he doesn't articulate it this way or directly, but as an artist, he is seeing what liberal capitalism is about. It's the end of a whole period, right? Right? Yeah, so he's writing this in the light of this, right? Now we have neoliberal, who are our authors? Is going to be David Foster Waugh? I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is a question we have to ask. Volman, what's his name? William Volman. These are the kind of people. But anyway, the question for Sartre in some ways, and certainly to me, is how does Lukács miss all this, right? What is going on in this incredibly brilliant, highly educated mind, student of Zimmel, Dilthey, Emile Lask, right? In contact with the greatest minds of his generation, right? Why is he missing this? Why is he missing the aspect of subjectivity that is very much needed? Even though, Sartre is going to say, I mean, this is still comrade, Lukács, in a way. Yeah? So why does he relegate it to a category called irrationalism? Yeah?
Called what?
Irrationalism.
Oh,
Irrationalism. It's the philosophy of the destruction of reason, right? In a sense, yeah. So I think this is what he's really up to. I don't think it's just this kind of one-upmanship or this kind of stuff. There are real stakes for these people. These are people that are this is blood, playing out. I mean, this is real struggle. I mean, these are people. Sartre was put in a Stalag too for a little while. I mean, he wasn't as active in the resistance as one would have thought, but he did his part, and he wrote Being and Nothingness in '43, during the occupation, etc. So his praxis was the writing and the plays, The Condemned of Valtona, which is a great play where he comes up with this great phrase, "I am condemned to be free." We're condemned. We're not just to be free. We're condemned to be free. I think that's a wonderful phrase, because what it carries with us is this enormous burden and responsibility, in a sense. So anyway, so Lukács never speaks of this kind of freedom. Lukács's bet is on the subject of history, right? The proletariat. The subject-object unity, the subject of history is the proletariat. It is for Sartre too, but a different kind of, culture and a different kind of proletariat, right? In some ways, yeah. So I mean, those are just thoughts off and in a way, I mean, Sartre is really trying to agree with Marx that social being determines consciousness. He's not denying that, yeah. But at the same time, he wants to keep the consciousness of freedom, the consciousness of lived experience, operative at the same time, just instead of saying this is a social and economic determinism at work. I don't think Lukács gets into that point, automatic Marxism or this kind of thing. But we do see it a lot. We see it in a lot of the groups out there too. We begin to see this kind of automatic, yeah. I mean, you kind of almost get to the point where it's predictable what you're going to hear out of these certain groups. It's like you've already heard the music, you've seen the movie, multiple times, and there's no creativity. So in some ways, yeah. So I think that's what he's criticizing in Lukács as a comrade. Comrade Lukács, you have the wherewithal to see this, but you're not seeing it, in some ways. So, yeah, anyway, yeah. So there's a long footnote, by the way, page, just going back to what we said on idealism and materialism on page 32 and 33. If you have the book, or it's
I
worth
don't-
getting.
yeah,
It's
I'll
worth
get it, I'll
studying.
get it.
Yeah.
I think the
yeah,
footnote is the most interesting part of the whole
Yeah, it
thing.
is. It is a very. Yeah, go ahead.
And how
talk about that,
Marxism,
yeah.
you know, has this or could have this tendency to fall back into this kind of idealism.
Yes.
And then he sort of is this confrontation of how not to fall into idealism.
Exactly.
Is actually very beautiful.
Yes.
And really to the point, I think.
I'll read you, just before you go, real quickly, on the bottom of 32 in the footnote, there are two ways to fall into idealism.
Yeah.
The one consists of dissolving the real in subjectivity. The other in denying all real subjectivity in the interests of objectivity. The truth is that subjectivity is neither everything nor nothing. It represents a moment in the objective process. Interesting. That in which externality is internalized. And this moment is perpetually eliminated only to be perpetually reborn. Now, each of these ephemeral moments which rise up in the course of human history and which are never either the first or the last, is lived as a point of departure by the subject of history. Class consciousness, Lukács here, right, is not the simple lived contradiction which objectively characterizes the class considered, right? It's not imposed from without. It's not thrust upon. Is that contradiction already surpassed by praxis and thereby preserved and denied all at once? It's part of the Affenbois, part of the, suppression, the lifting higher, this kind of movement. But it is precisely this revealing negativity, this distance within immediate proximity, which simultaneously constitute what existentialism calls consciousness of the object. I am the object in this process, and the non-thetic self-consciousness. So together, I am the object, but at the same time, I don't have a positive consciousness. Thetic is from the Greek goddess Themis, is where thesis comes from. Yeah, in a way, how you posit something. Yeah. So this is very good. Josh, you wanted to comment on another? These were the two traps of idealism.
Yeah.
And then he goes back, you can read in this essay, you can go back to the Hungarian 56, uprising, what he's trying to do here, because he's using, that's his example that unfolds back into the theory he's trying to do in this becoming in the world. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh no, I mean I thought this was a great essay. I liked it so much that I read the rest of the book.
Good.
And
That's
he
what we're
had-
supposed to do. We would be pleased.
He had other things to say that we didn't read about the project that I thought were really great,
Yeah.
and ultimately about there was another section about the event. He also has his own sort of conception of the event.
He does, yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. It was apart from Badiou and
Yes,
from Deleuze.
yes.
Which may be a kind of a simpler version than theirs, his sort of characterization event, but I thought it was really an interesting one.
Well, the interesting thing about Sartre to me, even though he's a master of abstractions,
Yeah.
and he understands
Yeah.
very well
Yeah.
this movement, he's always living in the situation,
Mhm.
right, in a way. And his notion of the situation is that moment, right, in which something's happening,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And in this sense, it's a very different notion of event that
Mhm.
becomes big history, like
Yeah.
in the Badiouian sense, or yeah.
It was sort of like the contradiction, like hadn't sort of been fully matured or developed
Right.
or something.
That's
like,
right.
And that's what the event is. It unfolds
Right.
over time that way, which I
Right.
thought was really
Right,
great.
right.
I also thought his sort of relationship to Adorno was kind of interesting. That piece that we read, subject, object, he also goes into sort of his own conception, very similar one.
Yes.
The subject object
Right.
relationship.
Yeah, Adorno went after Sartre,
Did he?
many times.
I was gonna ask about
Negative dialectics, I think it's about 35 pages in, there's a
Yeah.
section on Sartre and existentialism, as did Marcuse,
Right.
too. And then Marcuse, full circle after this came out, said he's impressed every word of the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Every time he picks it up, he became more impressed. Marcuse said this in the late 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyway, I mean, this is again,
Yeah.
I mean, worthy of a very long.
Definitely. That's what I think,
long,
too.
Long thinking here. But the relationship to Lukács, they considered Lukács to be the leading. Merleau-Ponty actually had conversations with Lukács too. So, you know, they were in contact at conferences and stuff like that. So they all knew each other, you know, in some ways. And I think one of the attempts was the French always have this way of, let's bring these people closer to a different kind of open-ended thinking. And that was the thing. It was an invitation to Lukács. You know, not only a polemic, antagonistic dialectic, but an invitation. When he says Lukács has the wherewithal to read Heidegger but doesn't do so, that's an invitation. Why don't you at least consider the design analytic in this sense? We all know he's a Nazi for, you know, a few years, etc. You know, yeah. But anyway, that, yeah, it goes without saying, you know. So, yeah, yeah.
But then I thought also that
Della Volpe was a collaborator. I mean, you know, he was
Was
in
he?
Mussolini.
Really?
He changed completely afterward. This is one of the reasons the party never let him, you know, be the, you know, the chief spokesman. You know, you look at him. I mean, you know, he has that tendency of Mussolini. Right? Yeah. Up to, you know. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if it clarified, but you know, it's a good thing. Lukács and Sartre would be a great another kind of, you know, relationship that should be looked at, and look at it through the categories: reification, alienation, objectification, right? Notions of history, process, becoming, and ultimately their relation, if you really wanted to frame it the right way, relationship to Hegel. You know what is being seen here in Hegel, you know, in a way, because they're both very Hegelian Marxists. These are both thinkers of the totality. You know, Sartre will take the totality of Lukács that we read earlier in the semester and put it into a more comprehensive totalization. He'll speak of totalization.
I
Yeah,
think
please.
Jameson says in the introduction that Sartre's idea of totalization is actually deliberately a polemic against
Yes,
Lukács'
yes,
idea of totality, and
yes.
I think it works brilliantly.
Yeah.
I mean, totality in Lukács is just...
You mean in the new version of the critique
Sorry,
of
the
dialectical
critique of
reason?
dialectical
Yeah,
reason,
not in
yeah.
this. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you know, in Lukács, totality it's like Spinozistic or Hegelian
It is.
monism.
It
right?
is.
It's just
It
a
is a monism.
static
Yeah.
whole.
It's a static.
Whereas totalization in Sartre, when we get later
It's
in this
becoming.
essay, is the example that I really liked was the idea of a work of art. I thought of like the four movements of a symphony, right? Like a totalization of a symphony. The parts,
Right.
the whole of a symphony, like its four movements, only becomes a totality when you, the listener, listen to it and create that totality
Yes.
yourself. You are
Good
the
point.
totalizing process that creates that unity. And so those two contrasting versions of totalization, to me, perfectly describe the
Mhm.
opposition.
No, it's
between
well
Sartre
put.
and
Yeah,
Lukács.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, there you go.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'll write you two next
Okay,
week.
yeah, no problem, and I'll you know, for the people leaving, I'll be in touch about next week too. Yeah, we would meet here if we do. Chris, I've finished with your thing. I'll give you a call. Okay? Yeah.
Okay.
It's getting better.